The story of the Latins begins in the volcanic landscape of central Italy, where archaeological evidence reveals a distinct Italic people emerging from the broader cultural matrix of Iron Age peninsular societies. During the first millennium BC, the region known as Latium, stretching roughly from the Tiber River southward to the Volscian Mountains and eastward into the Apennine foothills, witnessed the crystallization of Latin identity through material culture, linguistic development, and social organization that would ultimately reshape the Mediterranean world. Excavations throughout the Alban Hills, the extinct volcanic complex southeast of modern Rome, have yielded compelling evidence of Latin settlements dating to approximately 1000 BC. The archaeological record from sites like Castel Gandolfo, Marino, and the broader Colli Albani region reveals communities that practiced distinctive burial customs and produced material culture markedly different from their Italic neighbours. Latin cremation burials from this period, found in biconical urns placed within circular pits, contrast sharply with the inhumation practices prevalent among the Sabines to the northeast and the mixed burial traditions of the Volsci to the south. These urns, typically fashioned from impasto pottery with geometric decorations, often contained bronze fibulae, iron weapons, and personal ornaments that reflect both local craftsmanship and limited trade connections with Etruscan territories to the north. The material culture of early Latin settlements demonstrates a society transitioning from the late Bronze Age traditions of the Apennine culture toward more sophisticated Iron Age practices. Bronze Age predecessors in the region had left traces of the so-called Proto-Villanovan culture, characterized by cremation in biconical urns. But the emerging Latin communities of the early Iron Age developed distinctive ceramic traditions and metalworking techniques. Their pottery assemblages include characteristic storage jars, cooking vessels, and serving bowls that exhibit local stylistic preferences while showing limited influence from neighbouring Etruscan and Greek traditions. Iron implements recovered from Latin sites include spearheads, knives, and agricultural tools that suggest a mixed economy based on both pastoralism and nascent agriculture. Settlement patterns across Latium during this formative period reveal communities typically situated on defensible hilltops overlooking river valleys and coastal plains. These locations provided strategic advantages for both defence and resource exploitation, with access to the fertile volcanic soils that would later support intensive agriculture. The Latin preference for elevated settlements, evident at sites like the future location of Rome's Palatine Hill and the various communities scattered throughout the Alban Hills, reflects practical considerations of security and environmental adaptation rather than mere cultural preference. The linguistic evidence for Latin origins provides another crucial dimension for understanding this Italic people's emergence. Latin belongs to the Indo-European language family, specifically within the Italic branch that includes Oscan, Umbrian, and several smaller regional languages of ancient Italy. Comparative linguistic analysis suggests that Proto-Italic, the hypothetical common ancestor of these languages, likely entered the Italian peninsula during the second millennium BC, possibly through gradual migration and cultural diffusion rather than sudden invasion. The evolution from Proto-Italic to distinct Latin represents a complex process of linguistic differentiation that occurred over several centuries. Early Latin inscriptions, though sparse before the 7th century BC, reveal a language already distinct from its Italic cousins in several key features. The Latin treatment of certain Indo-European consonant clusters, the development of specific vowel systems, and particular morphological innovations distinguish it from Oscan and Umbrian, even in its earliest attested forms. The famous pranestive fibula, if authentic, provides glimpses of archaic Latin that demonstrate the language's early divergence from other Italic tongues. Oscan, spoken primarily in the southern Apennines and parts of Campania, retained certain archaic Indo-European features that Latin had already modified by the historical period. Umbrian, documented primarily through the Iguvine tables from the 3 RD1 centuries BC, shows different patterns of phonological development and maintains grammatical structures that Latin had simplified or abandoned. These linguistic differences suggest that the various Italic peoples, while sharing common ancestry, had developed distinct cultural and linguistic identities well before their historical interactions with expanding Roman power. The legendary traditions surrounding Latin origins, while historically problematic, provide insight into how later generations understood their cultural heritage. The Aeneas tradition, most famously elaborated in Virgil's Aeneid, but drawing on much earlier sources, presents the Trojan hero as the founder of the Latin people through his establishment of Lavinium. According to this tradition, Aeneas landed on the Italian coast after the fall of Troy, married Lavinia, daughter of the local king Latinus, and founded the first Latin settlement at Lavinium, located near the coast south of the Tiber mouth. Archaeological investigation at the site identified with ancient Lavinium has revealed Iron Age settlement remains consistent with the legendary chronology, though the material evidence cannot confirm the specific narrative details. The site shows continuous occupation from the 9th century BC, with evidence of both indigenous development and external cultural influences that might reflect the kind of cultural mixing described in the foundation myths. Votive deposits and sanctuary remains from later periods suggest that Lavinium maintained special religious significance within the Latin cultural sphere, supporting ancient traditions about its foundational importance. The Aeneas tradition, as preserved in various ancient sources including Dionysius of Halicarnassus and Livy, describes the hero's integration with existing Latin populations rather than their conquest or displacement. This narrative framework suggests ancient recognition that Latin culture emerged through cultural synthesis rather than simple ethnic replacement. The marriage alliance between Aeneas and Lavinia symbolically represents the integration of external influences with indigenous traditions, producing the distinctive Latin identity that would eventually dominate central Italy. Beyond the Aeneas narrative, Latin foundation traditions included stories of various eponymous heroes and divine interventions that explain the origins of particular communities. These myths, while historically unreliable, reflect genuine cultural memories of tribal movements, alliance formations, and territorial settlements that shaped early Latin society. The recurring themes of divine guidance, marriage alliances, and territorial grants in these traditions suggest that early Latin communities understood their origins in terms of complex negotiations between indigenous populations and incoming groups. The social organization of early Latin communities reveals a tribal structure based on kinship groups, territorial divisions, and shared religious practices. Archaeological evidence suggests that Latin settlements were typically organized around extended family units occupying distinct residential areas within larger community boundaries. House foundations from sites like the Palatine Hill in Rome indicate multi-room structures that could accommodate extended families, with associated storage facilities and workshop areas that suggest household-based craft production. Burial evidence provides crucial insights into early Latin social stratification and family organization. Cremation cemeteries associated with Latin settlements show varying levels of grave goods that indicate emerging social hierarchies. Elite burials contain bronze vessels, imported pottery, and elaborate personal ornaments, while simpler graves hold basic ceramic vessels and minimal metalwork. This differentiation suggests that Latin society had developed recognizable status distinctions by the early Iron Age, though the extreme wealth disparities characteristic of later periods had not yet emerged. The pastoral component of early Latin economy is evident in faunal remains from settlement sites, which show high proportions of sheep, goat, and cattle bones. These animals provided not only meat and dairy products, but also raw materials for textile production, leatherworking, and bone tool manufacture. The volcanic pastures of the Alban Hills and the broader Latium region offered excellent grazing, supporting substantial herds that formed the foundation of Latin wealth and social organisation. Agricultural development among the Latins benefited enormously from the region's volcanic soils, which provided exceptional fertility for cereal cultivation. The tephra deposits from ancient volcanic activity in the Alban Hills created deep, nutrient-rich soils ideally suited for wheat, barley, and legume production. Early Latin agricultural techniques, reconstructed from archaeological evidence and comparative ethnographic studies, likely included simple plough agriculture, crop rotation systems, and integrated pastoral agricultural land use that maximised the productive potential of diverse environmental zones. The integration of pastoral and agricultural activities in Latin economic life created a distinctive settlement pattern that influenced later Roman territorial organisation. Latin communities typically controlled territories that included both upland pastures and lowland agricultural areas, requiring seasonal movement of livestock and coordinated labour for agricultural activities. This economic system fostered the development of territorial concepts and resource management practices that would later influence Roman approaches to provincial administration and colonial settlement. Religious practices among early Latin communities centred on agricultural and pastoral concerns, with deities associated with fertility, weather, and livestock protection. Archaeological evidence from sanctuary sites suggests that Latins worshipped gods connected to specific landscape features, seasonal cycles, and community welfare. Votive offerings from these sites include ceramic vessels, bronze implements, and animal sacrifices that reflect the agricultural basis of Latin religious life. The development of shared religious practices among Latin communities created cultural bonds that transcended individual settlement boundaries. Festival cycles, seasonal celebrations, and pilgrimage traditions linked scattered communities through common ritual activities and sacred narratives. These religious connections provided frameworks for political cooperation, military alliance, and cultural exchange that would prove crucial in later Latin responses to external threats and opportunities. The religious connections that bound early Latin communities through shared festivals and sacred narratives provided the foundation for a more formalised confederation that emerged during the 7th and 6th centuries BC. This political and religious alliance, known as the Foedus Latinum or Latin League, represented a sophisticated response to the mounting pressures facing Latin communities from Etruscan expansion northward and increasing military challenges from neighbouring Italic peoples. The League's establishment marked a crucial transition from loosely affiliated tribal communities to a coordinated confederation capable of collective military action and unified religious expression. Archaeological evidence from the sanctuary complex atop Mons Albanus, the highest peak of the Alban Hills known today as Monte Cavo, reveals the physical centre around which this confederation crystallised. Excavations have uncovered substantial foundation remains of the temple dedicated to Jupiter Latiaris, constructed using massive blocks of local peperino stone quarried from the volcanic slopes. The temple's orientation followed traditional Italic religious architecture, facing eastward toward the rising sun, with a deep pronaos supported by wooden columns and a cellar housing the cult statue of the supreme Latin deity. Votive deposits surrounding the sanctuary contain thousands of ceramic offerings, bronze implements, and miniature weapons that demonstrate the site's importance to communities throughout Latium. The choice of Mons Albanus as the League's religious centre reflected both practical and symbolic considerations that resonated across Latin territory. The mountain's elevation provided visibility across the entire region, allowing smoke from sacrificial fires to be seen from settlements as distant as the coastal communities near Lavinium and the inland towns approaching Praenesta. This visual connection reinforced the spiritual bonds linking member communities while providing a practical means of communication during religious festivals and emergency situations. The mountain's association with Jupiter, the sky god whose dominion extended over weather, warfare, and political authority, established divine sanction for the League's activities and decisions. The approximately 30 cities that comprise the Latin League represented the full spectrum of Latin settlement types and economic specializations that had developed across the region. Alba Longa, situated on the northwestern slopes of the Alban Hills, held special prominence within the Confederation due to its legendary status as the mother city of Latin civilization. Archaeological investigations at the site have revealed substantial Iron Age fortifications constructed from local stone, with walls following the natural contours of the hillside to create a defensible perimeter encompassing residential areas, storage facilities, and religious precincts. The city's material culture demonstrates sophisticated metalworking capabilities, with bronze foundries producing weapons, tools, and decorative objects that circulated throughout Latin territory. Lavinium maintained its foundational significance within the League structure, serving as the primary centre for ancestral cults and hero worship that legitimised Latin claims to territorial control. The city's sanctuary complex, dedicated to the Penates and associated with Aeneas traditions, housed sacred objects and performed rituals that connected all Latin communities to their shared mythological heritage. Excavations have uncovered a substantial archaic temple with terracotta architectural decorations showing Greek stylistic influences, indicating Lavinium's role in mediating cultural exchange between Latin communities and Greek colonies in southern Italy. The city's position near the coast facilitated trade connections, while its inland territorial holdings provided agricultural resources that supported its religious and political functions. Aricia occupied a strategically crucial position, controlling access routes through the Alban Hills and maintaining one of the most important sanctuaries dedicated to Diana Nemorensis. This goddess, associated with hunting, fertility, and woodland protection, attracted worshippers from across central Italy to her sacred grove beside Lake Nemi. The sanctuary's international reputation brought diplomatic contacts and commercial opportunities that enhanced Aricia's influence within the Latin League. Archaeological evidence reveals that the city controlled substantial territory extending from the lakeshore into the surrounding hills, with numerous villa sites and agricultural installations demonstrating intensive land use and considerable wealth accumulation. Tusculum, perched on a commanding height overlooking the approaches to Rome from the southeast, developed as a major military and administrative centre within the League structure. The city's massive fortification walls, constructed using polygonal masonry techniques that demonstrate advanced engineering capabilities, enclosed an urban area containing public buildings, residential quarters, and craft production areas. Tusculum's strategic location made it a crucial partner in League military operations, while its control over mountain passes and trade routes provided economic resources that supported its military contributions. The city's aristocratic families maintained extensive connections throughout Latin territory, creating networks of personal relationships that facilitated political cooperation and military coordination. The annual festival of the Ferie Latine represented the most visible expression of Latin unity and the primary mechanism for maintaining Confederation cohesion across diverse communities. This celebration, held each spring on Mons Albanus, brought together representatives from all League members to participate in elaborate sacrificial rituals and communal feasting that reinforced their shared identity and mutual obligations. The festival's timing coincided with the agricultural cycle, marking the completion of spring planting and invoking divine protection for growing crops throughout Latin territory. The central ritual of the Ferie Latinae involved the sacrifice of a white bull to Jupiter Latiaris, performed by religious officials representing the entire Confederation. This ceremony required precise adherence to traditional protocols, with specific roles assigned to different communities and elaborate purification procedures that prepared participants for divine communion. The sacrificial meat was distributed among all attendees according to established precedents that reflected each community's status and contributions to the League, creating a tangible expression of unity while acknowledging internal hierarchies and relationships. Subsidiary rituals during the festival included competitions, religious processions, and diplomatic meetings that served multiple functions within the Confederation structure. Athletic contests provided opportunities for young men from different communities to demonstrate their skills and establish personal relationships that transcended local boundaries. Religious processions carrying sacred objects and community standards created visual displays of League membership and solidarity. Diplomatic sessions allowed representatives to discuss common concerns, resolve disputes, and coordinate responses to external threats or opportunities. The festival's location on neutral territory, removed from any single community's direct control, ensured that all participants could attend without compromising their independence or dignity. The sanctuary's administration by rotating religious officials from different League members prevented any single city from dominating the Confederation's spiritual centre. This careful balance between unity and autonomy characterised the League's entire organisational structure, allowing diverse communities to cooperate effectively while maintaining their distinct identities and interests. Political cooperation within the Latin League operated through consensus-building mechanisms that respected member communities' autonomy while enabling collective decision-making on matters of common concern. The Confederation lacked centralised governmental institutions comparable to later Roman administrative structures, instead relying on networks of personal relationships, religious obligations, and shared interests to coordinate activities and resolve disputes. This decentralised approach reflected the diverse origins and continuing independence of League members while providing frameworks for effective cooperation when circumstances required unified action. Military coordination represented the League's most crucial function as Latin communities faced mounting pressures from Etruscan expansion and aggressive neighbouring peoples. Etruscan cities north of the Tiber had developed sophisticated military capabilities and territorial ambitions that threatened Latin independence and economic interests. Archaeological evidence from sites like Veii and Caere reveals substantial fortifications, advanced metallurgical techniques, and extensive territorial control that posed serious challenges to Latin communities' security and prosperity. The Etruscan military threat manifested through both direct territorial encroachment and economic pressure that disrupted traditional Latin trade patterns and resource access. Etruscan control over mineral resources in northern Latium and their advanced metalworking capabilities gave them significant advantages in weapons production and military equipment. Their urbanized society supported larger population concentrations and more specialized military forces than most Latin communities could individually maintain. Etruscan naval capabilities also threatened Latin coastal settlements and trade connections, requiring coordinated defensive responses that exceeded individual communities' resources. Latin military cooperation within the League structure involved standardized equipment, coordinated training, and unified command structures that maximized their collective defensive capabilities. Archaeological evidence from Latin military sites reveals increasing standardization in weapons and armor during the 6th century BC, suggesting coordinated production and distribution systems that equipped League forces with compatible equipment. Bronze spearheads, iron swords, and protective gear found at various Latin sites show consistent manufacturing techniques and design features that indicate centralized procurement or shared production standards. The League's military organization relied heavily on citizen soldiers drawn from the agricultural population of member communities. These forces combined traditional Latin fighting techniques with innovations adapted from Etruscan and Greek military practices encountered through warfare and cultural exchange. Latin warriors typically fought as heavy infantry, equipped with spears, swords and shields, organised into formations that emphasise collective discipline rather than individual heroics. This military system reflected the Confederation's political structure, requiring cooperation and mutual support while maintaining each community's distinct contributions and leadership roles. Defensive strategies developed by the Latin League focused on coordinated responses to external threats while maintaining the territorial integrity of individual member communities. The Confederation's military planning incorporated the region's natural defensive features, including the Alban Hills' elevated positions and the river systems that provided both barriers and communication routes. League forces could concentrate rapidly at threatened points while maintaining secure bases in fortified settlements throughout Latin territory. The success of Latin military cooperation became evident in their ability to resist Etruscan expansion and maintain independence despite facing technologically advanced and numerically superior enemies. This defensive effectiveness attracted additional communities to seek League membership or alliance, expanding Latin influence and creating buffer zones that enhanced overall security. The Confederation's military reputation also facilitated diplomatic relationships with other Italic peoples and Greek colonies that provided additional security guarantees and trade opportunities. The military successes that enabled the Latin League to maintain independence against Etruscan pressure simultaneously created complex relationships with their northern neighbours that extended far beyond simple warfare. While Latin resistance to Etruscan political dominance remained consistent throughout the 7th and 6th centuries BC, the proximity and advanced civilization of Etruscan cities generated extensive cultural and technological exchange that profoundly influenced Latin development. Archaeological evidence from Latin settlements reveals the selective adoption of Etruscan innovations in metallurgy, urban planning, and religious architecture, demonstrating a sophisticated approach to cultural borrowing that enhanced Latin capabilities without compromising their political autonomy. Etruscan influence on Latin material culture appears most dramatically in the realm of metalworking, where Latin craftsmen rapidly adopted advanced techniques for bronze casting and iron forging that had been developed in Etruscan workshops. Excavations at Latin sites from the 6th century BC reveal bronze vessels, decorative objects, and weapons that employ sophisticated lost wax casting methods previously unknown in the region. These techniques enabled Latin artisans to produce complex forms, including elaborate fibulae with intricate geometric patterns, ceremonial vessels with figural decorations, and weapons with improved metallurgical properties that enhanced their effectiveness in warfare. The transmission of these metallurgical innovations occurred through multiple channels that reflect the complex nature of Latin-Etruscan relationships. Captured Etruscan craftsmen, whether taken as prisoners of war or acquired through slave trading, brought technical knowledge directly into Latin workshops, where they trained local apprentices in advanced production methods. Intermarriage between Latin and Etruscan aristocratic families created kinship networks that facilitated peaceful technology transfer and cultural exchange. Trade relationships, despite periodic military conflicts, continued to operate through neutral intermediaries and during temporary truces, allowing Latin merchants to observe Etruscan manufacturing techniques and acquire finished products that served as models for local production. Latin adoption of Etruscan urban planning concepts transformed the physical organisation of their settlements while maintaining distinctively Latin social and political structures. Etruscan cities like Caere and Tarquinii had developed sophisticated approaches to urban design that included orthogonal street systems, centralised public spaces, and specialised districts for different economic activities. Latin communities selectively incorporated these planning principles, creating more organised urban environments that improved both defensive capabilities and commercial efficiency. The transformation of early Rome during the 6th century BC exemplifies this process, as the scattered hilltop settlements were connected through planned infrastructure, including the Forum Romanum as a central civic space and the Cloaca Maxima drainage system that employed Etruscan engineering techniques. Religious architecture provided another crucial avenue for Etruscan influence on Latin culture, as Latin communities adopted temple construction techniques and decorative traditions while maintaining their distinct theological concepts and ritual practices. Etruscan temples featured elevated platforms, deep porticos, and elaborate terracotta decorations that created impressive visual statements of divine presence and community prosperity. Latin communities incorporated these architectural elements into their own sacred buildings, constructing temples that employed Etruscan building techniques while housing traditional Latin deities and maintaining established ritual protocols. The Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on Rome's Capitoline Hill represents the most ambitious example of this architectural synthesis, combining Etruscan construction techniques with Latin religious traditions to create a structure that dominated the urban landscape while serving distinctively Roman political and spiritual functions. Archaeological investigation of the temple's foundations reveals massive tufa blocks quarried using Etruscan stone-cutting techniques, while the building's proportions and orientation followed traditional Italic religious architecture. The temple's terracotta decorations, including the famous quadriga sculpture group, were executed by Etruscan craftsmen working within Latin iconographic traditions that emphasize Jupiter's role as protector of the Roman community. Despite extensive cultural borrowing, Latin communities maintained fierce resistance to Etruscan political control throughout this period of intense interaction. Military conflicts between Latin League forces and Etruscan armies continued regularly, with battles fought over territorial boundaries, trade route control, and political independence. The archaeological record preserves evidence of these conflicts in the form of destroyed settlements, buried weapon caches, and fortification systems designed specifically to counter Etruscan military tactics. The Siege of Fidenae, an Etruscan outpost established on the east bank of the Tiber to control river traffic and threaten Latin territory, demonstrates the intensity of Latin resistance to Etruscan expansion. Archaeological excavations at the site have revealed multiple destruction layers from the 6th century BC, indicating repeated conflicts as Latin forces attempted to eliminate this strategic threat. The fortifications show evidence of sophisticated siege techniques employed by both sides, including earthwork approaches, wall mining operations, and defensive countermeasures that reflect advanced military engineering capabilities. Latin relationships with other Italic tribes presented different challenges and opportunities than their interactions with the more urbanized Etruscans. The Sabaeans, occupying the mountainous regions northeast of Latin territory, maintained a predominantly pastoral economy and tribal social organization that contrasted sharply with Latin agricultural intensification and urban development. Despite these cultural differences, Sabine-Latin relationships involved extensive intermarriage, seasonal migration patterns, and gradual territorial adjustments that created complex zones of cultural mixing and political cooperation. Archaeological evidence from border regions between Latin and Sabine territory reveals settlement patterns that reflect peaceful coexistence and cultural exchange rather than military confrontation. Sites like Gabii and Tibur show material culture assemblages that combine Latin ceramic traditions with Sabine metalworking techniques and decorative motifs. These hybrid cultural expressions indicate substantial population movement and intermarriage that created communities with mixed ethnic identities and dual cultural loyalties. The famous tradition of Sabine women's abduction by early Romans, while historically unreliable in its specific details, preserves cultural memories of intermarriage practices that facilitated peaceful relationships between these neighbouring peoples. Archaeological evidence supports the general pattern described in these traditions, showing increased Sabine material culture elements in Latin settlements during the 7th and 6th centuries BC. Burial practices in particular show syncretistic elements, with some Latin cemeteries containing graves that employ Sabine inhumation customs alongside traditional Latin cremation burials. Sabine religious practices influenced Latin spiritual traditions through the introduction of specific deities and ritual customs that became integrated into Latin sacred calendars. The goddess Vacuna, associated with agricultural fertility and pastoral protection, entered Latin religious practice through Sabine cultural transmission. Similarly, certain divination techniques and seasonal festivals show Sabine origins while becoming thoroughly incorporated into Latin religious life. These religious exchanges occurred through intermarriage relationships, seasonal migration patterns, and shared sanctuary sites that served both communities. The Aequian Volsci, controlling mountainous territories southeast and south of Latium respectively, presented more consistent military challenges to Latin expansion, while also participating in cultural exchange networks that connected central Italian peoples. These tribes maintained warrior cultures that emphasized raiding, cattle rustling, and territorial expansion at the expense of their more settled Latin neighbours. Archaeological evidence from Aequian and Volscian settlements reveals fortified hilltop sites with substantial defensive walls and weapon caches that indicate societies organised primarily for warfare. Military conflicts between Latin forces and Aequian warbands occurred regularly throughout the 6th and 5th centuries BC, with battles fought over territorial boundaries, grazing rights, and control of mountain passes that connected central Italy with southern regions. The archaeological record preserves evidence of these conflicts in burned settlements, hastily buried treasure hoards, and fortification systems designed to counter mountain warfare tactics. Latin military responses to Aequian and Volscian threats required different strategies than those employed against Etruscan forces, emphasizing mobility, mountain warfare techniques, and coordinated operations across difficult terrain. Despite frequent military conflicts, cultural exchange between Latins and these mountain peoples occurred through multiple channels that demonstrate the complex nature of ancient ethnic relationships. Prisoners of war, whether taken by Latin forces or acquired through ransom negotiations, brought cultural knowledge and technological innovations between communities. Seasonal trading relationships continued to operate even during periods of active warfare, with neutral meeting places and temporary truces allowing commercial exchange and cultural transmission. The gradual cultural assimilation of Aequian and Volscian populations into Latin society occurred primarily through territorial conquest and colonial settlement, rather than peaceful integration. As Latin military capabilities improved and territorial control expanded, defeated Aequian and Volscian communities were incorporated into Latin political structures while maintaining certain traditional practices and local identities. Archaeological evidence from formerly Aequian territories shows the replacement of traditional material culture with Latin ceramic traditions, construction techniques, and settlement patterns over several generations. Trade networks connecting Latin communities with neighbouring peoples and distant regions created extensive opportunities for cultural exchange that transcended political boundaries and military conflicts. Latin merchants established commercial relationships that extended from Etruscan cities in the north to Greek colonies in southern Italy, creating information and material exchange networks that brought technological innovations, artistic influences, and cultural practices into Latin society. The development of alphabetic writing among Latin communities exemplifies the complex pathways through which cultural innovation spread throughout central Italy. The Latin alphabet derived ultimately from Greek models, but the transmission process involved multiple intermediaries and adaptation stages that reflect the region's complex cultural interactions. Etruscan scribes had already adapted Greek alphabetic writing to their own linguistic needs, creating modified letter forms and orthographic conventions that better represented Etruscan phonological features. Latin adoption of alphabetic writing occurred through both Etruscan intermediaries and direct contact with Greek traders and colonists operating in central Italian markets. The earliest Latin inscriptions, dating to the 7th century BC, show letter forms and spelling conventions that reflect both sources of influence. Some inscriptions employ Etruscan letter variants and orthographic practices, while others show direct Greek influence in their alphabetic forms and writing directions. This dual transmission created a distinctively Latin writing tradition that incorporated elements from both sources while developing unique features suited to Latin linguistic requirements. The famous Praenesta fibula, if authentic, represents one of the earliest examples of Latin alphabetic writing and demonstrates the rapid adoption of this technology for personal and ceremonial purposes. The inscription's letter forms show Greek influence in their basic shapes while employing Etruscan-derived conventions for certain sounds that did not exist in Greek. The text itself, dedicating the fibula to a friend or patron, indicates that alphabetic writing quickly became integrated into Latin social practices and gift-giving customs. Commercial applications of alphabetic writing appear in Latin contexts slightly later than personal and religious uses, but rapidly became essential for recording transactions, marking property ownership and maintaining commercial records. Archaeological excavations at Latin trading centres have uncovered ceramic vessels with ownership marks, bronze weights with inscribed standards, and clay tablets with commercial notations that demonstrate the practical applications of literacy in economic activities. Greek artistic influences reached Latin communities through both direct contact with Greek traders and colonists, and indirect transmission through Etruscan intermediaries who had already incorporated Greek stylistic elements into their own artistic traditions. The result was a complex artistic synthesis that combined Greek technical innovations with Etruscan interpretative approaches and Latin cultural preferences, creating distinctive artistic expressions that reflected the multicultural environment of central Italy. Ceramic production in Latin workshops shows particularly clear evidence of Greek artistic influence, with painted pottery adopting Greek figural decoration techniques while maintaining traditional Latin vessel forms and functional requirements. Greek mythological subjects appear on Latin pottery alongside traditional Italic religious and social scenes, indicating cultural synthesis rather than simple artistic copying. The technical quality of this pottery demonstrates that Latin craftsmen had mastered sophisticated production techniques, including controlled firing atmospheres, refined clay preparation, and complex decorative applications. Bronze working in Latin communities incorporated Greek artistic conventions for figural representation while maintaining traditional Italic preferences for geometric decoration and functional design. Elaborate bronze vessels produced in Latin workshops show Greek influence in their figural handles and decorative reliefs while retaining distinctively Italic proportions and surface treatments. These hybrid artistic expressions indicate active cultural negotiation rather than passive reception of foreign influences. Architectural sculpture in Latin religious and civic buildings demonstrates similar patterns of selective cultural borrowing and creative adaptation. Terracotta decorations from Latin temples show Greek influence in their figural modelling techniques and compositional arrangements, while depicting distinctively Latin religious subjects and maintaining traditional Italic architectural integration. The technical sophistication of these sculptures indicates that Latin craftsmen had access to Greek artistic training while developing their own interpretative approaches and cultural expressions. Intermarriage between Latin aristocratic families and their counterparts in neighbouring communities created kinship networks that facilitated cultural exchange and political cooperation across ethnic boundaries. These marriage alliances served multiple functions, establishing peace agreements, creating trade partnerships, and transmitting cultural knowledge between communities. Archaeological evidence for these relationships appears in burial practices, material culture distributions, and settlement patterns that reflect mixed ethnic identities and cultural synthesis. Elite Latin burials from the 6th century BC contain grave goods that reflect diverse cultural origins and artistic traditions, indicating marriage relationships that brought foreign objects and cultural practices into Latin communities. Etruscan jewellery, Sabine metalwork, and Greek pottery appear together in these burials alongside traditional Latin artefacts, creating material culture assemblages that reflect the complex cultural identities of aristocratic families with multiple ethnic affiliations. Diplomatic treaties between Latin communities and neighbouring peoples established formal frameworks for peaceful coexistence, while creating mechanisms for conflict resolution and mutual assistance. These agreements, preserved in later historical sources and reflected in archaeological evidence, demonstrate sophisticated approaches to international relations that balance competitive interests with cooperative benefits. Treaty relationships facilitated trade, regulated territorial boundaries, and established procedures for handling disputes that might otherwise lead to warfare. The cultural diffusion resulting from these diplomatic relationships appears in shared religious practices, artistic conventions, and technological innovations that spread throughout central Italy despite political boundaries and ethnic differences. Sanctuary sites serving multiple communities, seasonal festivals involving diverse participants, and craft production centres employing mixed workforces created environments where cultural exchange occurred naturally and continuously, gradually creating shared traditions that transcended original ethnic identities while maintaining distinctive local characteristics. The diplomatic treaties and cultural exchange networks that had facilitated peaceful coexistence among central Italian peoples during the 6th century BC created the conditions for a dramatic shift in regional power dynamics. Within this complex web of relationships, one Latin settlement positioned strategically along the Tiber River began demonstrating capabilities and ambitions that would fundamentally alter the balance of power throughout Latium. The legendary founding of Rome in 753 BC, while historically problematic in its specific details, represents the crystallization of a community that combined traditional Latin cultural elements with innovations borrowed from Etruscan, Sabine, and Greek sources to create a uniquely effective approach to urban organisation, military coordination, and territorial expansion. Archaeological evidence from the Palatine Hill reveals continuous settlement from at least the 9th century BC, with substantial architectural developments occurring during the 8th and 7th centuries that transformed scattered hilltop villages into a unified urban community. Excavations have uncovered house foundations, constructed using sophisticated drainage techniques that prevented water damage and structural collapse during the region's seasonal rainfall patterns. These buildings employed mortise and tenon joinery for wooden frameworks, with walls constructed from wattle and daub panels that provided effective insulation while remaining economical to construct and maintain. The presence of substantial storage facilities, workshop areas, and communal cooking spaces indicates household organisation patterns that supported extended family groups while enabling craft specialisation and surplus accumulation. The integration of multiple hilltop settlements into a single political entity required engineering projects that demonstrated both technical capability and organisational coordination exceeding that of neighbouring Latin communities. The construction of the Cloaca Maxima drainage system employed Etruscan hydraulic engineering techniques to create underground channels that collected surface water and sewage from throughout the settlement area, directing these materials into the Tiber River through carefully graded tunnels carved from solid rock. This infrastructure project required coordinated labour from hundreds of workers over multiple construction seasons, indicating political authority capable of organising large-scale public works and economic resources sufficient to support non-productive activities. The Forum Romanum's development as a central civic space demonstrates Roman adoption of Etruscan urban planning concepts while maintaining distinctively Latin political and social functions. The Forum's location in the marshy valley between the Palatine and Capitoline hills required extensive drainage work and soil stabilisation before construction of permanent buildings could begin. Archaeological investigation reveals multiple construction phases during the 7th and 6th centuries BC, with successive generations expanding and improving the Forum's facilities to accommodate growing population and increasingly complex political activities. Early Roman religious architecture incorporated Etruscan construction techniques and decorative traditions, while housing distinctively Latin deities and maintaining established ritual protocols. The Temple of Vesta, housing the sacred fire that symbolised community continuity and divine protection, employed circular construction techniques derived from traditional Latin hut architecture, while incorporating Etruscan stoneworking methods and decorative elements. The temple's perpetual fire required constant attention from specially trained priestesses, creating religious institutions that demonstrated Roman commitment to traditional Latin spiritual practices while displaying the community's growing wealth and organisational capabilities. The Regia, serving as the residence and headquarters of Rome's early kings, combined Etruscan palatial architecture with traditional Latin ceremonial requirements to create a structure that projected royal authority while maintaining connection to ancestral customs. Archaeological excavations have revealed substantial foundation walls constructed from carefully fitted tufa blocks, with architectural decorations including terracotta roof tiles and sculptural elements that employed advanced Etruscan manufacturing techniques. The building's interior organisation included audience halls, private residential quarters, and religious shrines that accommodated both political administration and ceremonial functions. Roman military organisation during this early period reflected the community's position within the Latin League, while incorporating innovations that enhanced effectiveness beyond traditional Latin capabilities. The legendary military reforms attributed to King Servius Tullius, while historically uncertain in their specific details, represent systematic changes in military recruitment, equipment standardization, and tactical organization that provided Rome with significant advantages over neighboring communities. Archaeological evidence supports the general pattern of military innovation described in these traditions, showing increased standardization in weapons and armor during the 6th century BC alongside evidence for expanded military participation across broader social categories. The centuriate system, organizing Roman military forces according to wealth classifications and age categories, created a more flexible and effective military structure than the traditional tribal levies employed by other Latin communities. This system enabled Rome to field larger forces while maintaining better discipline and coordination during military campaigns. Wealthy citizens provided their own equipment and served as heavy infantry, while poorer citizens served as light troops or support personnel according to their economic capabilities and military training. This organisation maximised military participation while ensuring that equipment quality and tactical roles matched individual resources and capabilities. Roman adoption of manipular tactics, derived from Samnite military innovations but adapted to Roman organisational requirements, provided significant advantages in the varied terrain and tactical situations encountered during central Italian warfare. Unlike the rigid phalanx formations employed by Greek armies and some Etruscan forces, manipular organisation divided military units into smaller, more flexible subunits that could manoeuvre independently while maintaining mutual support and coordination. This tactical flexibility proved particularly effective in the mountainous terrain and irregular warfare conditions that characterised conflicts with Achaean and Volscian forces. The gradual emergence of Roman leadership within the Latin League during the 6th and 5th centuries BC resulted from a combination of military effectiveness, diplomatic skill, and economic resources that enabled Rome to provide benefits to League members while advancing its own territorial and political interests. Roman military contributions to League campaigns consistently exceeded those of other member communities, both in terms of troop numbers and tactical effectiveness. This military prominence created opportunities for Roman commanders to assume leadership roles in joint operations while establishing personal relationships with aristocratic families throughout Latin territory. Roman diplomatic initiatives within the League structure demonstrated sophisticated understanding of member communities' diverse interests and concerns, enabling Rome to broker agreements and resolve disputes that enhanced overall confederation effectiveness. Roman negotiators developed reputations for fairness and reliability that encouraged other communities to seek Roman mediation in territorial disputes, commercial disagreements, and succession crises. These diplomatic successes enhanced Roman prestige while creating networks of obligation and mutual interest that facilitated Roman influence over League decisions and policies. Economic resources generated by Roman territorial expansion and commercial development provided the material foundation for enhanced military capabilities and diplomatic influence. Roman control over Tiber River trade routes enabled the community to profit from commercial traffic between inland territories and coastal markets, generating revenues that supported military equipment, public works projects, and diplomatic activities. Roman merchants established trading relationships throughout central Italy and beyond, creating information networks and commercial partnerships that enhanced Roman understanding of regional political developments and economic opportunities. The complex relationship between Rome and other Latin cities during this period involved constant negotiation between cooperative obligations and competitive ambitions that created tensions even as it facilitated mutual benefits. Rome's growing military and economic capabilities enabled the community to provide valuable services to League partners, while simultaneously creating concerns about Roman domination and the erosion of traditional confederation equality. Other Latin communities recognized the advantages of Roman leadership in military campaigns and diplomatic negotiations, while remaining wary of excessive dependence on Roman power and resources. Alba Longa's relationship with Rome exemplified these tensions, as the traditional mother city of Latin civilization found its ceremonial precedents challenged by Roman practical achievements and growing influence. Archaeological evidence from Alba Longa during the 6th century BC reveals continued prosperity and substantial public works projects, indicating that the community maintained significant resources and political capabilities. However, Roman military successes and territorial expansion gradually overshadowed Alba Longa's traditional leadership role within the League structure, creating political tensions that would eventually result in direct conflict. The legendary destruction of Alba Longa by Roman forces, while historically uncertain in its specific details, represents the kind of territorial consolidation and political reorganization that characterized Roman expansion throughout this period. Archaeological evidence shows significant destruction and abandonment at the site during the 7th or 6th century BC, followed by Roman colonial settlement and territorial incorporation that eliminated Alba Longa as an independent political entity. This pattern of conquest, destruction, and reorganization became characteristic of Roman territorial expansion throughout central Italy. Lavinium's relationship with Rome involved different dynamics, as the city's religious significance and coastal location provided resources and capabilities that complemented rather than competed with Roman strengths. Roman recognition of Lavinium's foundational importance within Latin tradition created opportunities for cooperative relationships that enhanced both communities' positions within the League structure. Roman support for Lavinium's religious activities and commercial development generated mutual benefits while establishing precedents for Roman leadership in League affairs. The role of figures like Coriolanus in early Roman-Latin relations while surrounded by legendary elaborations that obscure historical details, reflects genuine tensions between Roman ambitions and traditional Latin political structures. The Coriolanus tradition describes a Roman aristocrat whose military achievements against Volscian forces enhanced Roman prestige, while his political conflicts with Roman popular assemblies led to his exile and subsequent military service with Rome's enemies. This narrative framework, regardless of its historical accuracy, preserves cultural memories of the kinds of personal and political conflicts that accompanied Rome's rise to regional prominence. Archaeological evidence supports the general pattern of Roman expansion and Latin resistance described in the Coriolanus traditions, showing increased military activity and territorial changes throughout the region during the early 5th century BC. Fortification construction and destruction layers at various Latin sites indicate widespread warfare and political instability that accompanied the transformation of traditional league relationships into Roman hegemonic control. These material remains demonstrate that Rome's rise to dominance involved significant military conflict and political reorganization, rather than peaceful evolution or voluntary submission. Roman expansion beyond traditional Latin territory brought the community into direct conflict with Achaean and Volscian forces, while creating opportunities for territorial acquisition and resource control that enhanced Roman capabilities relative to other Latin communities. Roman military campaigns in the Apennine foothills and Lepine Mountains employed coordinated strategies that combined traditional Latin military techniques with innovations derived from conflicts with diverse enemies. These campaigns required sustained military effort over multiple seasons, demonstrating Roman organizational capabilities that exceeded those of traditional Latin military structures. The impact of Roman expansion on traditional Latin political structures involved gradual transformation rather than sudden replacement, as Roman influence operated through existing institutions while modifying their functions and relationships. Roman leadership in League military campaigns created precedents for Roman command authority that gradually became institutionalized and expected. Roman diplomatic initiatives in resolving inter-community disputes established Roman arbitration as the preferred mechanism for conflict resolution, reducing the independence and authority of traditional Latin political assemblies and religious councils. Roman colonial foundations in conquered territories introduced new models of territorial organization and political control that differed significantly from traditional Latin settlement patterns. These colonies combined Roman citizens with Latin settlers and incorporated local populations according to systematic policies that balanced security requirements with economic development and cultural integration. Colonial administration employed Roman legal concepts and governmental structures while accommodating local customs and maintaining connections to both Roman and Latin cultural traditions. The transformation of military recruitment and service obligations throughout Latin territory reflected Roman influence on traditional confederation structures. Roman military innovations, including improved training methods, standardized equipment, and enhanced logistical support, became models that other Latin communities adopted to maintain military effectiveness and league membership. This standardization process gradually created military forces throughout Latin territory that employed Roman organizational concepts and tactical methods while maintaining nominal independence and local leadership. Religious developments during this period demonstrate Roman influence on traditional Latin spiritual practices while showing continued respect for established sacred traditions and ceremonial precedents. Roman participation in the Feria Latinae and other League religious festivals involved increasingly prominent roles in ritual activities and ceremonial leadership that reflected Roman political influence while maintaining the Confederation's religious unity. Roman religious innovations, including new temple construction projects and enhanced festival celebrations, provided models that other Latin communities emulated while adapting to their own spiritual traditions and community requirements. The gradual establishment of Roman hegemony over Latin territory occurred through accumulated precedents and institutional changes, rather than formal conquest or political annexation. Roman military leadership, diplomatic authority, and economic influence created practical dependencies that transformed league relationships while maintaining theoretical equality and traditional ceremonial forms. This transformation process enabled Rome to achieve regional dominance while avoiding the kind of direct confrontation that might have united other Latin communities in resistance to Roman ambitions. The institutional changes and accumulated precedents that had established Roman hegemony over Latin territory by the middle of the 4th century BC created mounting tensions that would eventually explode into the most decisive conflict in Latin history. The transformation of league relationships through Roman military leadership, diplomatic authority, and economic influence had fundamentally altered the balance of power within the Confederation while maintaining the theoretical framework of equality and mutual cooperation that had originally bound Latin communities together. By 343 BC, these contradictions had become unsustainable, as Roman actions increasingly violated traditional Latin rights and privileges in ways that threatened the very foundations of Latin political independence and cultural autonomy. The immediate causes of the Latin War emerged from Roman colonial policies that directly challenged traditional Latin privileges regarding territorial expansion and settlement rights. The establishment of Roman colonies at Culls in 334 BC and Fregellae in 328 BC had proceeded without consultation with the Latin League, despite these foundations occurring in territories that had traditionally required Confederation approval for settlement activities. Roman colonists received land grants and political privileges that exceeded those available to Latin settlers, creating a two-tiered system that contradicted the principle of equal partnership that had governed League colonial activities since the Confederation's establishment. Archaeological evidence from Cales reveals substantial urban planning and infrastructure development that employed Roman engineering techniques and architectural standards, while excluding traditional Latin community participation in the foundation process. The colony's street layout followed Roman orthogonal planning principles with standardized lot sizes and public building locations that reflected Roman urban design concepts, rather than the more flexible settlement patterns characteristic of traditional Latin foundations. Defensive walls constructed using Roman masonry techniques enclosed an area sufficient for significant population expansion, indicating Roman intentions to establish a major regional centre rather than a simple military outpost. The exclusion of Latin communities from command positions in joint military campaigns represented another crucial source of conflict that undermined traditional Confederation equality. Roman commanders had increasingly assumed sole authority over League military operations, relegating Latin contingents to subordinate roles that reduced their influence over strategic decisions and tactical implementations. This command structure violated ancient precedents that had distributed military leadership among League members according to their contributions and regional expertise, creating resentment among Latin aristocratic families whose traditional military roles and social status depended on leadership opportunities in Confederation campaigns. Roman recruitment policies during the 340 SBC further exacerbated these tensions by imposing military service obligations on Latin communities without providing corresponding political representation or decision-making authority. Roman demands for Latin military contributions exceeded traditional Confederation requirements, while offering no compensation in the form of territorial gains, commercial privileges, or political influence. Latin communities found themselves providing soldiers and resources for campaigns that primarily served Roman interests, while receiving diminishing benefits from their continued League membership. The crisis reached its breaking point when Rome unilaterally negotiated a treaty with the Samnites in 343 BC that committed Latin military resources to conflicts in southern Italy, without consulting League assemblies or obtaining Confederation approval. This treaty violated fundamental principles of Latin League governance that required collective decision-making on matters affecting all member communities. Roman assumption of authority to commit Latin forces to external conflicts without consultation represented a direct assault on Latin political autonomy that could not be tolerated without abandoning any pretense of confederation equality. Archaeological evidence from Latin settlements during the early 340 SBC reveals increased military preparations and defensive construction projects that indicate widespread anticipation of armed conflict. Fortification walls at sites like Tibur and Praenesta show evidence of hasty repairs and structural reinforcements using locally quarried stone and timber, suggesting communities were preparing for siege warfare. Weapon caches buried at various Latin sites contain standardized spearheads, sword blades, and shield components that indicate coordinated military procurement and distribution systems designed to equip substantial forces for extended campaigns. The Latin response to Roman violations of traditional Confederation principles involved careful diplomatic coordination among member communities to present a united front while avoiding premature military confrontation. Latin ambassadors conducted negotiations with neighbouring Italic peoples, including Volscian and Aequian tribes, seeking military alliances and territorial agreements that would provide strategic advantages in the anticipated conflict with Rome. These diplomatic initiatives reflected sophisticated understanding of regional power dynamics and military requirements that would be necessary to challenge Roman hegemony successfully. Campanians played a crucial role in the developing crisis by requesting Roman military assistance against Samnite attacks, while simultaneously offering alliance terms to Latin communities seeking to reduce Roman influence in central Italy. The Campanians' strategic position controlling fertile agricultural territories and important trade routes made their allegiance valuable to both Roman and Latin political calculations. Archaeological evidence from Campanian sites reveals substantial wealth accumulation and urban development during this period, indicating communities capable of providing significant military and economic resources to their chosen allies. The formal declaration of war occurred when Latin League representatives demanded restoration of traditional Confederation privileges and Roman recognition of Latin political equality within the alliance structure. These demands included restoration of Latin command rights in joint military operations, consultation requirements for colonial foundations, and equal distribution of territorial gains from future conquests. Roman rejection of these terms left Latin communities with no alternative except military action to preserve their political independence and cultural autonomy. The initial phase of the conflict involved careful positioning and alliance building, as both sides sought strategic advantages before committing to major military engagements. Roman forces concentrated in defensive positions around the city while dispatching diplomatic missions to secure neutrality or support from neighbouring peoples who might otherwise assist Latin military efforts. Latin armies assembled at traditional Confederation gathering points in the Alban Hills while coordinating with Volscian and Campanian allies to create multiple threats that would prevent Roman forces from concentrating against any single enemy army. The first significant engagement occurred near Mount Vesuvius when Roman forces under Titus Manlius Torquatus encountered a combined Latin Campanian army that had been conducting raids against Roman territorial holdings in northern Campania. The battle's location reflected the strategic importance of controlling access routes between central and southern Italy, as victory would determine which side could maintain communication and supply lines with potential allies in both regions. Archaeological surveys in the area have identified weapon fragments and skeletal remains consistent with a substantial military engagement, though precise battlefield boundaries remain difficult to establish due to subsequent agricultural activities and urban development. Roman tactical advantages in this engagement derived from their superior discipline and coordination, developed through years of military campaigns against diverse enemies throughout central Italy. Roman manipular formations provided flexibility that enabled rapid response to changing battlefield conditions while maintaining unit cohesion and mutual support. Latin forces, despite their numerical advantages and local terrain knowledge, struggled to coordinate effectively with their Campanian allies, whose different military traditions and tactical preferences created communication difficulties and strategic confusion during critical phases of the battle. The Roman victory near Vesuvius demonstrated their military superiority while providing strategic benefits that enhanced their position for subsequent campaign operations. Roman control of the battlefield enabled recovery of equipment and supplies from defeated enemies while denying these resources to surviving Latin forces. More importantly, the victory secured Roman communication lines with potential allies in southern Italy, while preventing Latin forces from establishing secure bases in Campanian territory. Latin forces regrouped in the Alban Hills following their defeat near Vesuvius, utilizing familiar terrain and traditional defensive positions to reorganize their military capabilities while seeking additional allies among central Italian peoples. The withdrawal to traditional Confederation territory reflected both practical military considerations and symbolic importance, as the Alban Hills represented the spiritual and political centre of Latin identity. Archaeological evidence from the region shows extensive military activity during this period, including temporary fortifications, weapon production sites, and supply storage facilities that indicate substantial military preparations. Roman pursuit of retreating Latin forces created opportunities for the decisive engagement that would determine the war's outcome. Roman commanders recognized that eliminating organized Latin military resistance required preventing enemy forces from establishing secure defensive positions in mountainous terrain, where Roman tactical advantages would be reduced. The strategic imperative of forcing a conclusive battle while maintaining Roman advantages led to aggressive pursuit tactics that brought Roman armies into direct confrontation with concentrated Latin forces. The Battle of Trifonum represented the climactic engagement of the Latin War, with both sides committing their primary military resources in a confrontation that would determine the future of central Italian political organisation. The battle's location near modern Minturni provided relatively open terrain that favoured Roman manipular tactics, while offering sufficient defensive positions to encourage Latin commanders to accept battle rather than continue retreating into more mountainous regions. Archaeological investigation in the area has revealed substantial evidence of ancient military activity, including weapon fragments, armour components, and burial sites that indicate a major engagement involving thousands of combatants. Roman tactical superiority proved decisive at Trifonum, as their disciplined formations and coordinated manoeuvres overcame Latin numerical advantages and defensive positioning. Roman commanders effectively utilized their cavalry forces to prevent Latin flanking movements while concentrating infantry assaults against weak points in enemy formations. The battle's progression involved multiple phases as Roman forces systematically eliminated Latin defensive positions while preventing organised withdrawal or regrouping attempts. The collapse of Latin military resistance at Trifonum resulted from cumulative factors including heavy casualties among leadership personnel, breakdown of communication between allied contingents, and psychological impact of sustained Roman tactical successes. Archaeological evidence suggests that the battle's final phases involved widespread abandonment of equipment and positions as Latin forces disintegrated into scattered groups, attempting individual escape rather than coordinated withdrawal. This military catastrophe eliminated organised Latin resistance while providing Romans with substantial quantities of captured equipment and prisoners. Roman victory at Trifonum created the conditions for a comprehensive political settlement that would permanently transform the relationship between Rome and Latin communities. The magnitude of Latin military defeat eliminated any possibility of continued armed resistance, while demonstrating Roman military superiority in terms that could not be disputed or reversed through future political negotiations. Latin communities faced the choice between accepting Roman terms for political reorganisation or facing individual conquest and territorial annexation that would eliminate their political existence entirely. The dissolution of the Latin League as a political entity marked the end of over 3 centuries of confederation government and the termination of Latin political independence. Roman settlement terms required individual Latin cities to negotiate separate agreements with Rome, eliminating the collective bargaining power and mutual support systems that had enabled Latin communities to maintain their autonomy despite Roman hegemonic pressure. This fragmentation of Latin political organisation ensured that future resistance to Roman authority would require individual community decisions rather than confederation-wide coordination. Roman settlement policies toward defeated Latin communities established precedents for confederation management that would become fundamental principles of Roman territorial administration throughout the Mediterranean world. Rather than imposing uniform terms on all defeated enemies, Roman negotiators created differentiated categories of alliance and citizenship that reflected individual community circumstances while serving Roman strategic and political requirements. This flexible approach enabled Rome to reward cooperation, punish resistance, and create incentives for future loyalty while maintaining effective control over conquered territories. The grant of full Roman citizenship to certain Latin communities represented the most favourable settlement terms available, providing complete integration into Roman political and legal systems while eliminating previous Latin identity and independence. Communities receiving this status gained access to Roman legal protections, commercial privileges, and political participation, while accepting obligations for military service and taxation according to Roman requirements. Archaeological evidence from communities receiving citizenship shows rapid adoption of Roman material culture, construction techniques, and urban planning concepts that indicate successful integration into Roman society. Latin rights, granted to communities that maintained nominal independence while accepting Roman oversight, created an intermediate status that preserved local governmental structures while ensuring Roman control over external relations and military obligations. Communities with Latin rights retained their traditional political institutions and cultural practices while accepting Roman authority in matters affecting regional security and territorial administration. This arrangement enabled Rome to maintain effective control while minimizing administrative costs and potential sources of local resistance. The establishment of Roman colonies in strategic locations throughout former Latin territory provided permanent Roman presence and military control while creating opportunities for Roman citizens to acquire land and economic advancement. These colonial foundations employed Roman urban planning and governmental structures while incorporating local populations according to policies that balanced security requirements with economic development needs. Colonial administration provided training grounds for Roman governmental personnel while creating loyal populations committed to Roman political and military success. The transformation of military recruitment throughout central Italy reflected Roman integration of former Latin communities into expanded military systems that provided greater manpower resources while ensuring political control through service obligations and veteran settlement programs. Former Latin communities contributed soldiers to Roman armies while receiving reduced political influence over military decision-making and strategic planning. This arrangement provided Rome with substantially increased military capabilities while eliminating potential sources of organised resistance to Roman authority. Religious continuity within the new Roman Confederation structure maintained traditional Latin spiritual practices while subordinating them to Roman political authority and administrative oversight. The Feriae Latinae continued as an annual celebration, but under Roman sponsorship and direction, rather than as an expression of Latin political independence. Roman participation in traditional Latin religious activities demonstrated respect for established customs while asserting Roman leadership in spiritual as well as political matters. The long-term consequences of the Latin War's settlement established patterns of Roman territorial administration that would be applied throughout subsequent Mediterranean conquests. But the immediate challenge facing Roman administrators involved the practical implementation of these new political arrangements across communities with centuries of independent governance traditions. The transformation from confederation equality to Roman hegemony required sophisticated legal frameworks that could accommodate diverse local circumstances while maintaining effective central control. The development of Latin rights emerged as the most innovative solution to this administrative challenge, creating a distinct legal status that preserved essential elements of local autonomy while ensuring Roman oversight and military coordination. The conceptual foundation of Latin rights derived from Roman recognition that complete political integration through full citizenship grants would eliminate valuable local expertise and cultural traditions while creating administrative burdens that exceeded Roman governmental capabilities. Simultaneously, simple alliance treaties of the traditional type had proven inadequate for maintaining reliable control over strategically important communities whose loyalty remained essential for regional security. Latin rights represented a carefully calibrated intermediate status that provided sufficient privileges to ensure community cooperation while maintaining Roman authority over crucial political and military decisions. The commercial component of Latin rights, known as commercium, granted communities the legal capacity to conduct business transactions with Roman citizens according to Roman commercial law, rather than the complex international agreements that had previously governed intercommunity trade. This privilege eliminated the legal uncertainties and transaction costs that had historically complicated commercial relationships between Latin communities and Roman merchants, creating expanded opportunities for economic development while integrating local economies into broader Roman commercial networks. Archaeological evidence from communities receiving Latin rights shows rapid expansion of commercial infrastructure, including improved harbour facilities, enlarged marketplace areas, and standardized weights and measures that facilitated trade with Roman merchants and other communities within the Roman Confederation. The implementation of commercium required substantial legal and administrative infrastructure to resolve disputes, enforce contracts, and maintain commercial standards across diverse communities with different traditional practices. Roman legal experts established procedures for handling commercial disagreements that arose between Roman citizens and Latin rights holders, creating precedents that would later influence commercial law throughout the Roman world. These legal developments involved complex negotiations between Roman legal principles and local commercial customs, producing hybrid systems that preserved essential elements of traditional practices while ensuring compatibility with Roman legal requirements. The marriage rights component, termed connubium, permitted legal marriages between Roman citizens and Latin rights holders that produced legitimate children with clearly defined legal status and inheritance rights. This privilege addressed practical concerns about family relationships and property transfers that had become increasingly complex as Roman territorial expansion created mixed populations throughout central Italy. The grant of connubium reflected Roman recognition that stable family relationships across community boundaries would strengthen political ties, while providing mechanisms for gradual cultural integration that respected traditional family structures and social hierarchies. The practical application of connubium involved detailed legal regulations governing property rights, inheritance procedures, and citizenship transmission that required careful coordination between Roman and local legal systems. Children born from marriages between Roman citizens and Latin rights holders typically received the higher legal status, creating incentives for intermarriage while ensuring that Roman citizenship remained valuable and sought after. Archaeological evidence from family burial sites in communities with Latin rites reveals increasing patterns of intermarriage and cultural mixing that demonstrate the effectiveness of these legal arrangements in promoting social integration. The transformation of former Latin League cities into Roman municipia represented the most comprehensive form of integration available to communities that demonstrated exceptional loyalty or possessed strategic importance that warranted special consideration. Municipal status provided local self-governance privileges that preserved traditional political institutions while requiring acceptance of Roman oversight in matters affecting regional security and external relations. Municipal communities retained their local magistrates, popular assemblies, and judicial systems while accepting Roman-appointed officials who monitored compliance with confederation requirements and coordinated with central Roman administration. The administrative structure of Roman municipia required careful balance between local autonomy and central control that would maintain community cooperation while ensuring effective implementation of Roman policies. Local magistrates continue to handle routine governmental functions including tax collection, public works supervision, and civil dispute resolution, but their decisions remained subject to review by Roman officials who possessed authority to intervene when local actions conflicted with broader Roman interests. This dual administrative system created opportunities for local political leadership while preventing the development of independent policies that might threaten Roman authority or regional stability. Archaeological investigation of municipal communities reveals substantial public works projects undertaken during the decades following the Latin War settlement, including forum construction, temple renovation, and infrastructure improvements that demonstrate both local prosperity and Roman administrative support. These building projects employed Roman architectural techniques and urban planning concepts, while incorporating traditional local elements that maintain community identity and cultural continuity. The scale and sophistication of municipal construction activities indicate that Roman integration policies provided economic benefits that compensated for reduced political independence. The establishment of Roman colonii in strategic locations throughout former Latin territory created permanent Roman presence while providing opportunities for Roman citizens to acquire land and economic advancement in regions that required reliable political control. Colonial foundations differed fundamentally from traditional Latin settlements in their systematic planning, standardized governmental structures, and direct subordination to Roman administrative authority. Roman colonists received land grants, construction materials, and initial supplies that enabled rapid establishment of functioning communities, while accepting military service obligations and political loyalty requirements that ensured colonial reliability during regional crises. Colonial urban planning employed standardized designs that reflected Roman engineering capabilities and administrative requirements, while adapting to local geographical conditions and resource availability. The typical Roman colony featured orthogonal street systems with standardized lot sizes, centrally located forums containing public buildings and commercial facilities, and defensive walls constructed using Roman masonry techniques. Archaeological excavation of colonial sites reveals construction quality and urban amenities that exceeded those available in most traditional Italian communities, demonstrating Roman commitment to colonial success and settler satisfaction. The integration of local populations into colonial communities required policies that balanced security considerations with economic development needs, while maintaining Roman political control. Indigenous inhabitants who demonstrated loyalty during the Latin War settlement received opportunities for economic participation and limited political involvement within colonial structures, while those who had actively resisted Roman authority faced property confiscation and potential relocation. These policies created incentives for cooperation, while eliminating potential sources of local resistance to Roman colonial administration. Military integration of Latin communities into Roman legionary structures represented perhaps the most significant transformation resulting from the war's settlement, as traditional Latin military organisations had emphasised confederation equality and rotating command responsibilities that conflicted with Roman requirements for unified command and standardised tactics. The incorporation of former Latin forces into Roman military systems required extensive retraining, equipment standardisation, and organisational restructuring that eliminated traditional Latin military identities while preserving valuable combat experience and regional expertise. The role of Latin allies in Roman military expansion throughout Italy reflected careful Roman calculation of the benefits and risks associated with employing former enemies in campaigns against other Italian peoples. Latin contingents provided substantial manpower that enabled Roman armies to undertake multiple simultaneous campaigns while maintaining adequate forces for territorial defence and internal security. However, the employment of Latin troops required constant attention to morale, loyalty and political reliability to prevent the development of military conspiracies or coordination with enemy forces. Roman military administrators developed sophisticated systems for managing Allied contingents that balanced operational effectiveness with political security concerns. Latin forces typically served under Roman commanders, but retained their traditional unit organisations and leadership structures to maintain morale and combat effectiveness. Equipment standardisation ensured tactical compatibility while preserving distinctive elements of Latin military tradition that maintained unit identity and pride. Supply systems provided equal treatment for Roman and Allied forces while maintaining separate administrative channels that enabled monitoring of Allied loyalty and performance. The tactical integration of Latin Allied forces into Roman military operations required adaptation of traditional Roman manipular formations to accommodate different fighting styles and equipment preferences that characterized various Italian military traditions. Latin heavy infantry, trained in traditional Confederation fighting techniques, required modification of their tactical approaches to achieve compatibility with Roman manipular maneuvers while maintaining their effectiveness in combat situations. Light infantry and cavalry forces from Latin communities provided capabilities that complemented Roman tactical strengths, while offering specialised skills particularly valuable in mountain warfare and siege operations. Archaeological evidence from military sites throughout Italy reveals the gradual standardisation of equipment and fortification techniques that resulted from the integration of Latin forces into Roman military systems. Weapon caches from the decades following the Latin War show increasing uniformity in spearhead designs, sword blade specifications, and shield construction that indicate systematic procurement and distribution systems serving integrated Roman Latin military forces. Fortification remains from Roman military camps show incorporation of defensive techniques and construction methods that derived from Latin military engineering traditions, demonstrating mutual influence and tactical adaptation within the integrated military system. Cultural and religious syncretism between Latin and Roman traditions required careful negotiation between Roman political requirements and local spiritual practices that maintained community identity and social cohesion. Roman religious policy toward conquered territories generally emphasized tolerance and incorporation rather than suppression, recognizing that religious persecution created unnecessary sources of resistance, while religious accommodation could strengthen political loyalty through demonstration of Roman respect for local traditions. The preservation of local cults within the broader Roman religious framework involved complex theological and administrative arrangements that maintained traditional ritual practices while subordinating them to Roman political authority. Local deities retained their traditional names, attributes, and ceremonial requirements while being interpreted as regional manifestations of Roman gods, or as specialized divine functions that complemented the Roman pantheon. This theological flexibility enabled Roman administrators to respect local religious sensibilities while ensuring that religious activities supported rather than challenged Roman political authority. The continued celebration of the Feriae Latinae exemplified Roman approaches to religious integration that maintained traditional ceremonies while transforming their political significance. The annual festival retained its traditional location on Mons Albanus and preserved established ritual procedures, but Roman officials assumed primary responsibility for festival organisation and religious leadership. This arrangement demonstrated Roman respect for Latin religious traditions while asserting Roman authority over activities that had previously symbolised Latin political independence and confederation unity. Archaeological investigation of religious sites throughout former Latin territory reveals substantial construction and renovation activities during the decades following Roman integration, indicating both Roman support for local religious practices and community prosperity that enabled enhanced ceremonial activities. Temple construction employed Roman architectural techniques and decorative elements, while maintaining traditional spatial arrangements and ritual requirements that preserved essential elements of local religious identity. Votive offerings from these sites show combinations of Roman and traditional Latin artistic styles that demonstrate cultural synthesis rather than simple Roman cultural dominance. The integration of Latin religious festivals into the Roman sacred calendar created opportunities for maintaining traditional celebrations while subordinating them to Roman administrative oversight and political coordination. Local festivals retained their seasonal timing and ceremonial content, while accepting Roman officials' participation and authority over activities that might affect regional security or political stability. This arrangement enabled communities to maintain important cultural traditions while ensuring that religious gatherings did not provide opportunities for political organisation or resistance activities. Roman administration of former Latin territories required development of governmental institutions and legal procedures that could effectively manage diverse communities with different traditional practices while maintaining uniform standards for taxation, military recruitment, and judicial administration. The complexity of these administrative challenges led to innovations in Roman governmental organisation that would later prove essential for managing the much larger territories acquired during Mediterranean expansion. The establishment of regular administrative circuits enabled Roman officials to maintain contact with municipal and allied communities throughout central Italy, while providing mechanisms for resolving disputes, collecting taxes, and coordinating military recruitment. These administrative tours required substantial logistical support and local cooperation that created opportunities for ongoing negotiation between Roman requirements and local concerns. Archaeological evidence from administrative centres reveals construction of facilities designed to accommodate travelling officials and their staffs, including guest quarters, record storage areas, and meeting halls that facilitated efficient governmental operations. The administrative circuits and governmental innovations developed for managing former Latin territories provided the organisational foundation for Rome's most ambitious and systematic territorial expansion programme, the establishment of coloniae Latinae throughout the Italian peninsula. These Latin colonies represented a revolutionary approach to territorial control that combined military security, economic development, and cultural transmission in ways that would fundamentally transform the demographic and political landscape of Italy. Unlike the traditional Greek colonial model, which emphasized commercial outposts and independent city-states, or the Etruscan approach of gradual territorial absorption, Roman Latin colonies functioned as integrated components of an expanding confederation designed to project Roman power while spreading Latin legal traditions, linguistic practices, and cultural institutions across diverse geographical and ethnic environments. The systematic establishment of Latin colonies began in earnest during the decades following the Latin War settlement, with the foundation of Signia in 495 BC representing one of the earliest examples of this new colonial model. Located on a commanding hilltop position overlooking the approaches to the Alban Hills from the southeast, Signia's strategic placement reflected Roman recognition that effective territorial control required permanent settlements capable of monitoring regional movement patterns while providing secure bases for military operations against hostile neighbours. Archaeological excavation of the colonial site reveals substantial defensive walls constructed using polygonal masonry techniques that created formidable barriers against siege warfare, with wall circuits encompassing sufficient area to accommodate significant population growth and economic development. The urban planning of Signia employed standardized Roman colonial design principles that would become characteristic features of Latin colonial foundations throughout Italy. The settlement street system followed orthogonal patterns that divided the enclosed area into regular blocks suitable for residential, commercial, and public use, with lot sizes calculated to provide adequate space for colonist families while maximizing defensive efficiency and administrative control. The central forum area contained standardized public buildings, including a basilica for judicial proceedings, a curia for local governmental meetings, and temples dedicated to the traditional Roman triad of Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, establishing religious practices that reinforced colonial connection to Roman spiritual traditions. The foundation of Norba in 492 BC demonstrated Roman commitment to systematic colonial expansion, despite ongoing military conflicts with neighbouring Italic peoples. Norba's location on the Lepine mountain slopes provided control over crucial passes connecting the Latin coastal plain with interior mountain regions, enabling colonial forces to monitor and regulate movement between different tribal territories while securing Roman access to strategic resources and trade routes. The colony's massive fortification walls, constructed from carefully fitted limestone blocks quarried from local sources, created defensive capabilities that exceeded those of most contemporary Italian settlements, reflecting Roman engineering expertise and commitment to colonial security. Archaeological investigation of Norba's residential areas reveals housing construction that employed standardized architectural techniques while accommodating diverse colonist backgrounds and economic circumstances. Colonial houses typically featured central courtyards surrounded by rooms designated for specific domestic functions, with construction materials and decorative elements that reflected Roman building traditions adapted to local environmental conditions and resource availability. The presence of substantial storage facilities, workshop areas, and commercial spaces indicates that colonial communities were designed to achieve economic self-sufficiency while maintaining commercial connections with broader Roman territorial networks. The selection and recruitment of Latin colonists required careful attention to demographic balance, economic skills, and political reliability that would ensure colonial success, while serving broader Roman strategic objective. Colonial recruitment typically involved Roman citizens seeking land ownership opportunities unavailable in increasingly crowded urban environments, allied Italian populations demonstrating loyalty in military service, and selected indigenous inhabitants whose cooperation facilitated peaceful territorial integration. This diverse colonial population created communities that combined Roman legal and political traditions with local knowledge and cultural practices, producing hybrid societies that effectively transmitted Roman influence while adapting to regional circumstances. The legal status of Latin colonists reflected the intermediate position these settlements occupied within the broader Roman Confederation structure. Colonial inhabitants received Latin rights that provided commercial privileges, marriage rights, and limited political participation, while maintaining obligations for military service and acceptance of Roman administrative oversight. This legal arrangement created incentives for colonial loyalty and cooperation, while ensuring that colonial communities remained integrated components of Roman territorial organisation rather than independent political entities with potentially conflicting interests. The economic foundation of Latin colonies relied on systematic land distribution programs that provided colonists with agricultural holdings sufficient to support family subsistence, while generating surplus production for commercial exchange and tax obligations. Colonial land assignments typically included both agricultural plots suitable for cereal cultivation and pastoral areas that supported livestock raising, creating diversified economic bases that reduced vulnerability to environmental fluctuations or market disruptions. Archaeological survey of colonial territories reveals extensive field systems, irrigation works, and storage facilities that demonstrate intensive agricultural development and sophisticated resource management practices. The integration of indigenous populations into colonial economic systems required policies that balanced security considerations with development needs, while maintaining Roman political control over potentially resistant local groups. Indigenous inhabitants who demonstrated cooperation during colonial foundation processes received opportunities for economic participation through land tenure arrangements, craft production activities, and commercial partnerships that provided material benefits while ensuring continued loyalty to Roman authority. Archaeological evidence from colonial sites shows gradual adoption of Roman material culture and construction techniques by local populations, indicating successful cultural integration rather than simple political subjugation. The role of Latin colonies in spreading Roman legal traditions throughout Italy involved the systematic implementation of Roman judicial procedures and legal concepts in regions that had previously operated according to diverse tribal and local legal systems. Colonial courts administered Roman civil law in disputes involving colonists, while developing hybrid legal procedures for cases involving indigenous populations or inter-community conflicts. These judicial innovations created precedents for legal integration that would later facilitate Roman territorial administration throughout the Mediterranean world, as colonial legal experiences provided practical models for managing diverse populations under unified legal frameworks. Colonial magistrates, typically Roman citizens appointed through established governmental procedures, assumed responsibility for implementing Roman legal standards while adapting to local circumstances and cultural sensitivities that affected judicial effectiveness. These officials received training in Roman legal principles and administrative procedures, while developing practical experience in managing diverse populations and resolving complex disputes that arose from cultural contact and economic competition. Archaeological evidence from colonial administrative centres reveals construction of specialised judicial facilities, including courtrooms, record storage areas, and detention facilities that demonstrate systematic approaches to legal administration and conflict resolution. The linguistic impact of Latin colonization involved the gradual spread of Latin language use throughout Italian territories that had previously employed diverse local languages and dialects. Colonial communities served as centres for Latin language instruction and use, as administrative, commercial and legal activities required communication in Latin, while social interaction between colonists and indigenous populations created opportunities for linguistic exchange and gradual adoption of Latin vocabulary and grammatical structures. Epigraphic evidence from colonial sites shows increasing use of Latin for public inscriptions, commercial records, and personal communications, indicating successful linguistic transmission despite the persistence of local languages for domestic and religious purposes. The educational infrastructure developed within Latin colonies included schools and training programs that transmitted Roman cultural values and practical skills to both colonist children and selected indigenous youth, whose families demonstrated loyalty and cooperation with colonial administration. These educational activities emphasise Latin literacy, Roman legal concepts, and technical skills required for economic development and administrative participation, creating local populations capable of supporting Roman governmental and commercial activities while maintaining cultural connections to Roman traditions and values. The religious role of Latin colonies in spreading Roman spiritual practices throughout Italy involved the establishment of standardized temple complexes and festival calendars that introduced Roman deities and ceremonial practices while accommodating local religious traditions that maintained community identity and social cohesion. Colonial temples typically housed the traditional Roman triad, while providing space for local deities that were interpreted as regional manifestations of Roman gods or specialized divine functions that complemented Roman religious concepts. Archaeological investigation of colonial religious sites reveals architectural features and votive offerings that demonstrate synthesis between Roman and local spiritual traditions rather than simple replacement of indigenous practices. The celebration of Roman religious festivals within colonial communities created opportunities for maintaining connection to broader Roman cultural traditions, while adapting ceremonial practices to local environmental conditions and cultural preferences. Colonial religious calendars incorporated major Roman festivals including the Saturnalia, Lupercalia, and various agricultural celebrations, while allowing space for local seasonal observances and community-specific traditions that maintained social solidarity and cultural identity. These religious activities served multiple functions, providing spiritual guidance, social entertainment, and political education that reinforced colonial loyalty while respecting local cultural sensitivities. The military function of Latin colonies as permanent bases for Roman territorial control required systematic recruitment, training, and equipment programs that maintained colonial defensive capabilities while providing military service to broader Roman strategic objectives. Colonial military forces typically included both colonist militias responsible for local defence and regular units that participated in Roman military campaigns throughout Italy and beyond. Archaeological evidence from colonial military installations reveals weapons, storage facilities, training areas, and fortification systems that demonstrate sophisticated approaches to military organisation and territorial security. The integration of colonial military forces into broader Roman military systems required standardization of equipment, tactics, and command structures that ensured tactical compatibility while maintaining colonial military identity and morale. Colonial troops received training in Roman manipular tactics and siege warfare techniques, while retaining specialized skills particularly valuable for operations in their regional environments, including mountain warfare, river crossing operations, and coordination with local allied forces. The effectiveness of colonial military contributions enhanced Roman military capabilities, while providing colonists with opportunities for advancement and recognition within Roman military hierarchies. The economic impact of Latin colonization on indigenous populations varied significantly depending on local circumstances, colonial policies, and the degree of cooperation or resistance encountered during foundation and development processes. Communities that welcomed colonial establishment typically benefited from improved agricultural techniques, expanded commercial opportunities, and access to Roman markets that increased local prosperity and economic development. Archaeological evidence from regions surrounding successful colonies shows increased settlement density, improved construction techniques, and expanded craft production that indicate economic growth and cultural development resulting from colonial contact. The transformation of local trade networks through colonial commercial activities created new opportunities for economic exchange, while disrupting traditional trading relationships that had connected indigenous communities for centuries. Colonial merchants established commercial connections with Roman urban markets while developing local trading networks that integrated indigenous producers into broader economic systems. These commercial relationships required adaptation of local production techniques, standardization of weights and measures, and development of credit and banking systems that facilitated long-distance trade while maintaining local economic autonomy and cultural identity. Agricultural development in colonial territories involved the introduction of Roman farming techniques, crop varieties, and land management practices that increased productivity while requiring substantial labour investments and technological adaptation. Colonial agricultural systems typically emphasised cereal production for both local consumption and export to Roman markets, supplemented by livestock raising, viticulture, and specialised crop production that took advantage of local environmental conditions and market opportunities. Archaeological investigation of colonial agricultural sites reveals extensive field systems, storage facilities, and processing installations that demonstrate intensive land use and sophisticated agricultural management. The development of craft production within colonial communities created opportunities for both colonist and indigenous artisans to develop specialised skills while serving local and regional market demands. Colonial workshops typically produced pottery, metalwork, textiles, and construction materials using techniques that combined Roman technological innovations with local materials and cultural preferences. Archaeological evidence from colonial craft production sites shows gradual technological improvement and increased production volume that indicates successful economic development and market integration. The transportation infrastructure developed to support colonial communities required substantial engineering projects that connected settlements with regional road networks, while providing secure routes for military movement and commercial transport. Colonial road construction employed Roman engineering techniques adapted to local geographical conditions, creating durable transportation systems that facilitated economic development while serving strategic military requirements. Archaeological investigation of colonial road systems reveals sophisticated construction techniques, including stone paving, drainage systems, and bridge construction that demonstrate advanced engineering capabilities and long-term planning perspectives. The administrative coordination required for managing multiple colonial foundations throughout Italy led to innovations in Roman governmental organisation that would prove essential for later Mediterranean expansion. But by the late 2nd century BC, the very success of these colonial and administrative systems had created new tensions that would fundamentally challenge the relationship between Rome and its Italian allies. The accumulated grievances of Latin communities and other Italian peoples, who had contributed substantially to Roman military victories and territorial expansion while receiving diminishing political benefits, reached a critical threshold during the 90s BC, when Roman political leaders began implementing policies that directly threatened the legal status and economic privileges that had sustained Italian loyalty for over 2 centuries. The immediate catalyst for what would become known as the Social War emerged from the political career of Marcus Livius Drusus the Younger, whose tribunate in 91 BC included proposals for extending Roman citizenship to Latin and Italian allies as compensation for their military service and territorial contributions. Drusus recognised that the existing system of differentiated legal statuses had become unsustainable as Italian communities provided increasing proportions of Roman military manpower while receiving reduced shares of territorial gains and commercial privileges. His legislative programme represented a systematic attempt to address these inequities through comprehensive political reform that would integrate Italian allies into the Roman citizen body, while maintaining effective central control over the expanded confederation. Archaeological evidence from Italian settlements during the early 1st century BC reveals substantial urban development and economic prosperity that contradicted their subordinate political status within the Roman Confederation. Sites like Asculum in Picenum show sophisticated public architecture, extensive commercial facilities, and substantial private residences that demonstrate wealth accumulation and cultural development exceeding that of many Roman municipalities. The contrast between Italian economic achievements and their limited political representation created resentment among local aristocratic families whose social status and regional influence were constrained by their exclusion from Roman political institutions and decision-making processes. The assassination of Drusus in late 91 BC eliminated the primary advocate for peaceful resolution of Italian grievances, while demonstrating Roman political resistance to meaningful reform of confederation relationships. Drusus had attempted to build coalitions that included both Roman popular leaders and Italian aristocratic representatives, creating legislative proposals that balance Roman security concerns with Italian demands for political equality. His death removed the possibility of negotiated settlement, while confirming Italian suspicions that Roman political institutions would never voluntarily grant the citizenship rights and political representation that Italian military contributions had earned through decades of loyal service. The outbreak of armed rebellion began in the Picene territory during the winter of 90 BC, when local magistrates at Asculum murdered a Roman praetor and his entourage, who had been investigating allegations of unauthorized citizenship grants to Italian allies. This violent incident reflected the accumulated tensions between Roman administrative oversight and Italian autonomous governance that had been building throughout the previous decade. Archaeological investigation at Asculum reveals extensive fortification construction during this period, including hastily built defensive walls and weapon storage facilities that indicate systematic preparation for armed resistance against Roman military retaliation. The spread of rebellion throughout central and southern Italy during early 90 BC demonstrated the extent of Italian dissatisfaction with Roman Confederation policies, while revealing sophisticated coordination among diverse Italian communities that had previously maintained separate political identities and regional loyalties. Samnite, Lucanian, and Apulian communities rapidly joined the rebellion despite their different languages, cultural traditions, and historical conflicts with each other, indicating shared grievances against Roman political dominance that transcended traditional ethnic and territorial divisions. The establishment of an Italian Confederation capital at Corfinium represented the most dramatic expression of Italian political ambitions and organisational capabilities. The rebels renamed the city Italica and established governmental institutions that consciously paralleled Roman political structures while emphasising Italian equality and democratic participation. Archaeological excavation at the site has revealed substantial construction activity during the brief period of rebel control, including forum renovation, administrative building construction, and coin minting facilities that produced currency-bearing inscriptions in both Latin and Oscan languages, demonstrating the rebels' commitment to maintaining Italian cultural diversity within a unified political structure. The Italian Confederation's military organisation revealed sophisticated strategic planning and resource coordination that enabled sustained resistance against Roman military superiority. Rebel forces employed traditional Italian military techniques adapted for coordinated operations across multiple theatres, with Samnite heavy infantry, Lucanian cavalry, and Picene light troops operating under unified command structures that maximise their collective effectiveness while maintaining regional military identities. Archaeological evidence from rebel military sites shows standardised weapon production and distribution systems that equip substantial forces with compatible equipment while utilising local manufacturing capabilities and resource bases. Roman military response to the Italian rebellion required mobilisation of resources and manpower that strained the Confederation's military capabilities while revealing the extent of Roman dependence on Italian allied contributions. Roman commanders discovered that traditional military recruitment systems could not provide adequate forces for simultaneous operations against multiple rebel armies while maintaining territorial defence and internal security throughout the remaining loyal territories. Archaeological evidence from Roman military sites during this period shows expanded fortification construction and weapon stockpiling that indicate recognition of the rebellion's serious threat to Roman territorial control and political authority. The siege of Asculum by Roman forces under Gnaeus Pompeius Strabo exemplified the brutal character of the social war and the determination of both sides to achieve decisive military victory rather than negotiated settlement. The siege lasted for several months during 89 BC, with Roman forces employing sophisticated siege techniques, including circumvallation walls, siege towers, and artillery bombardment that gradually reduced rebel defensive capabilities. Archaeological investigation of the siege works reveals extensive earthwork construction and weapon emplacement sites that demonstrate the scale and intensity of Roman military operations against fortified Italian positions. The fall of Asculum resulted in systematic destruction and population displacement that demonstrated Roman determination to eliminate organized Italian resistance while providing stark examples of the consequences of continued rebellion. Roman forces conducted extensive demolition of public buildings, residential areas, and fortification systems while deporting substantial portions of the surviving population to prevent future resistance activities. Archaeological evidence from the destruction layers shows evidence of deliberate fire setting and structural demolition that eliminated the city's capacity for continued military resistance, while serving as a warning to other rebel communities. Despite Roman military successes at individual siege operations, the overall strategic situation continued to favour Italian rebel forces, whose superior knowledge of local terrain and population support enabled sustained resistance operations that prevented decisive Roman victory. Italian forces employed guerrilla tactics that avoided direct confrontation with superior Roman armies, while conducting raids against Roman supply lines, isolated garrisons, and loyal communities that supported Roman military operations. These tactical approaches maximized Italian advantages, while minimizing the impact of Roman superiority in conventional battlefield engagements. The recognition that military victory alone could not resolve the fundamental political issues underlying the Italian rebellion led to Roman legislative initiatives designed to divide rebel coalitions while addressing legitimate Italian grievances through political concessions rather than continued warfare. The Lex Julia, passed in 90 BC, granted Roman citizenship to Latin colonies and Italian municipalities that had remained loyal to Rome during the rebellion, providing immediate benefits to communities that had resisted rebel recruitment while creating incentives for continued loyalty among wavering allies. The implementation of the Lex Julia required substantial administrative machinery to process citizenship applications, verify loyalty credentials, and integrate new citizens into Roman political and military systems without disrupting existing governmental structures or creating security vulnerabilities. Roman administrative personnel established processing centres throughout loyal territories where Italian representatives could present documentation of their community's loyalty, while receiving instruction in Roman legal procedures and political obligations that accompanied citizenship status. Archaeological evidence from these administrative sites shows construction of temporary facilities designed to accommodate large numbers of applicants while maintaining security and administrative efficiency. The Lex Plautia Papiria, enacted in 89 BC, extended citizenship opportunities to individual Italians who had participated in the rebellion but were willing to abandon armed resistance and accept Roman authority. This legislation recognized that many rebel participants had been motivated by legitimate grievances rather than fundamental hostility to Roman rule, creating opportunities for reconciliation and integration that could reduce rebel manpower while demonstrating Roman willingness to forgive past resistance in exchange for future loyalty. The law's implementation required careful verification procedures to distinguish between genuine converts and potential infiltrators, while providing adequate incentives to encourage widespread defection from rebel forces. The gradual success of Roman political concessions in dividing rebel coalitions and reducing Italian resistance demonstrated the effectiveness of combining military pressure with political accommodation in resolving complex territorial and ethnic conflicts. Communities that accepted Roman citizenship offers typically experienced immediate improvements in their legal status, commercial privileges, and political representation that validated their decisions to abandon rebellion while providing tangible benefits that encouraged continued loyalty. Archaeological evidence from communities that accepted citizenship shows rapid adoption of Roman administrative procedures, legal systems, and cultural practices that indicate successful integration rather than grudging submission. The transformation of former rebel leaders into Roman citizens and political participants represented one of the most significant aspects of the social war's resolution, as Italian aristocratic families who had led military resistance against Roman authority became integrated into Roman political institutions and social hierarchies. These individuals brought substantial local influence, military experience, and administrative capabilities that enhanced Roman governmental effectiveness, while ensuring that Italian integration occurred through cooperation rather than subjugation of local leadership structures. The final phase of the social war involved systematic reduction of remaining rebel strongholds. Through combined military operations and political negotiations that eliminated organised resistance, while providing opportunities for peaceful surrender and integration. Roman commanders coordinated military pressure with citizenship offers and amnesty programs that encouraged rebel communities to abandon hopeless resistance in favour of negotiated settlement terms that preserved community survival while accepting Roman political authority. The Siege of Nola represented the last major military operation of the social war, with Roman forces under Lucius Cornelius Sulla conducting systematic reduction of rebel defences while simultaneously negotiating with community leaders regarding surrender terms and citizenship arrangements. The siege's conclusion in 88 BC marked the effective end of organised Italian military resistance, while establishing precedents for post-conflict integration that would influence Roman approaches to territorial pacification throughout subsequent Mediterranean expansion. The comprehensive settlement of Italian grievances through citizenship grants and political integration eliminated the distinct legal and cultural identity that had characterized Latin communities since their original confederation formation in the 6th century BC. Former Latin cities became Roman municipalities with full citizenship rights and political representation, while their inhabitants gained access to Roman legal protections, commercial privileges, and political participation that had previously been restricted to Roman citizens. This transformation represented the culmination of a gradual process of cultural and political integration that had been developing for centuries, but reached completion through the crisis and resolution of the social war. The administrative challenge of integrating hundreds of thousands of new citizens into Roman political and military systems required substantial expansion of the governmental machinery and development of new procedures for managing enlarged citizen bodies while maintaining effective political control and military coordination. Roman administrators established new tribal divisions to accommodate Italian citizens, while modifying voting procedures and electoral systems to prevent Italian numerical dominance from overwhelming traditional Roman political leadership. These administrative innovations provided frameworks for managing the expanded citizen body while preserving essential elements of Roman political tradition and institutional continuity. The military implications of Italian integration involved substantial expansion of Roman military recruitment capabilities, while requiring adaptation of traditional legionary organisation to accommodate diverse Italian military traditions and cultural preferences. But the deeper transformation occurring throughout former Latin territories involved the systematic preservation and adaptation of ancestral religious practices within the expanding framework of Roman state religion. The integration of Latin sacred traditions into Roman religious life required sophisticated theological negotiations that maintained the spiritual efficacy of ancient rituals while subordinating them to Roman political authority and administrative oversight. The preservation of Latin religious festivals within the Roman sacred calendar demonstrated the complex process through which traditional practices survived political transformation while acquiring new meanings and functions. The Feriae Latinae continued as the most visible expression of Latin religious continuity, but Roman administration of the festival transformed its significance from a celebration of Confederation independence to a demonstration of Roman respect for ancestral traditions and regional cultural heritage. Archaeological evidence from the sanctuary of Jupiter Latiaris on Mons Albanus reveals substantial construction and renovation activities during the 1st century BC, including expanded altar areas, improved access roads, and enlarged accommodation facilities that indicate increased participation and enhanced ceremonial importance under Roman sponsorship. The annual procession of Roman magistrates to the Alban Mount for the Feriae Latinae created a powerful visual symbol of continuity between ancient Latin religious traditions and contemporary Roman political authority. The ceremony required the participation of Rome's highest officials, including consuls and praetors, who suspended their normal administrative duties to fulfill ancient religious obligations that predated Roman political dominance by centuries. This ritual participation demonstrated Roman acknowledgement of their Latin heritage, while asserting their right to assume leadership roles in ceremonies that had originally emphasized confederation equality and shared authority among member communities. Local Latin festivals throughout central Italy experienced similar processes of preservation and transformation as Roman administration sought to maintain community religious traditions while ensuring their compatibility with the broader Roman political objectives. The festival of Diana Nemorensis at Lake Nemi retained its traditional ritual procedures and seasonal timing, while accepting Roman oversight of sanctuary administration and ceremonial leadership. Archaeological investigation of the sanctuary complex reveals substantial Roman investment in facility improvement and expansion, including construction of elaborate guest quarters, expanded dining facilities, and improved harbour installations that accommodated increased pilgrimage activity from throughout the Roman world. The theological integration of Latin deities into the Roman pantheon involved complex interpretative processes that preserved essential divine attributes while creating compatibility with Roman religious concepts and political requirements. Traditional Latin gods retained their original names and ceremonial associations, while being understood as regional manifestations of Roman deities or specialized divine functions that complemented established Roman religious practices. This theological flexibility enabled Roman religious authorities to respect local, spiritual traditions while maintaining unified religious administration and preventing the development of alternative religious centers that might challenge Roman political authority. The cult of the Penates, central to Latin religious identity since the legendary arrival of Aeneas, exemplified the sophisticated approaches Roman religious administrators employed to preserve traditional practices while integrating them into broader Roman spiritual frameworks. The Penates retained their association with community protection and ancestral continuity, while being interpreted as household gods whose worship supported Roman family values and social stability. Archaeological evidence from domestic religious installations throughout former Latin territories shows continued veneration of Penates alongside traditional Roman household deities, indicating successful religious synthesis rather than replacement of indigenous practices. The linguistic transformation of Latin territories involved the gradual evolution from diverse local dialects towards standardized classical Latin, but this process occurred through cultural exchange and educational development rather than administrative imposition or cultural suppression. The establishment of schools and educational institutions in former Latin communities created opportunities for systematic Latin language instruction while preserving local linguistic traditions for domestic and ceremonial purposes. Epigraphic evidence from municipal and colonial sites shows increasing sophistication in Latin literary expression, alongside continued use of traditional local languages for specific cultural and religious functions. The development of Latin literature received crucial contributions from individuals with Latin backgrounds who brought regional perspectives, cultural traditions, and linguistic innovations to Roman literary culture. Writers like Ennius, whose Aeneas provided the first comprehensive epic treatment of Roman history, drew extensively on Latin oral traditions and historical memories that preserved cultural knowledge unavailable in purely Roman sources. His incorporation of traditional Latin narrative techniques and poetic conventions into Roman literary forms created hybrid artistic expressions that enriched Roman cultural life while preserving essential elements of Latin cultural heritage. The rhetorical traditions that flourished in Latin municipalities contributed significantly to the development of Roman oratory and political discourse through the training and cultural formation of individuals who would later achieve prominence in Roman political and intellectual life. Municipal schools in communities like Arpinum and Tusculum produced speakers whose mastery of Latin linguistic subtleties and regional cultural knowledge enhanced their effectiveness in Roman political forums, while introducing stylistic innovations and argumentative techniques derived from local educational traditions. Archaeological investigation of educational facilities in former Latin territories reveals substantial investment in library construction, classroom facilities, and residential quarters for students and instructors that indicate systematic approaches to cultural transmission and intellectual development. These institutions employed both Roman and local educational personnel who combined traditional Roman curriculum elements with regional cultural knowledge and specialized skills that reflected local economic and social requirements. The presence of substantial manuscript collections, writing materials, and scholarly apparatus demonstrates the sophisticated level of intellectual activity occurring in provincial educational centres. The preservation of Latin historical traditions within Roman historiographical literature create opportunities for maintaining community memories and cultural narratives that might otherwise have been lost during the process of political integration. Roman historians like Livy incorporated substantial material from Latin local histories and oral traditions that preserved detailed knowledge of Confederation politics, military campaigns, and cultural developments that predated Roman dominance. These historical works provided frameworks for understanding Latin contributions to Roman development, while maintaining respect for ancestral achievements and cultural values. The material culture of former Latin territories during the late Republican and early imperial periods reveals complex patterns of cultural continuity and transformation that demonstrate selective adaptation rather than wholesale replacement of traditional practices. Ceramic production in Latin workshops continued to employ traditional techniques and decorative motifs, while incorporating Roman stylistic elements and technical innovations that enhance product quality and market appeal. Archaeological assemblages from domestic sites show combinations of traditional Latin household implements with Roman imports and locally produced items that employed Roman manufacturing techniques, indicating gradual cultural synthesis rather than sudden cultural displacement. The architectural development of Latin municipalities involves systematic urban planning and construction projects that employed Roman engineering techniques while accommodating traditional community spatial arrangements and ceremonial requirements. Forum construction in cities like Tibur and Praeneste incorporated Roman architectural standards and administrative facilities while preserving traditional gathering spaces and religious precincts that maintained community identity and cultural continuity. These building projects demonstrated Roman investment in municipal development, while respecting local preferences and cultural sensibilities that affected community acceptance of Roman administrative oversight. Construction techniques employed in Latin municipal architecture reveal sophisticated adaptation of Roman engineering innovations to local materials, environmental conditions, and cultural preferences that created distinctive regional architectural traditions. Mason work in the Alban Hills utilised local pecorino stone, quarried using Roman extraction techniques, while employing traditional Latin construction methods that created structures combining Roman durability with familiar aesthetic qualities. Archaeological investigation of a municipal construction projects shows evidence of collaboration between Roman engineers and local craftsmen that produced hybrid building techniques, incorporating the best elements of both traditions. The development of commercial infrastructure in former Latin territories required substantial investment in harbour facilities, road construction, and market buildings that connected local economic activities with broader Roman commercial networks, while maintaining traditional trading relationships and production specializations. Archaeological evidence from commercial sites shows expansion of storage facilities, improvement of transportation connections, and standardization of weights and measures that facilitated integration into Roman economic systems while preserving local commercial practices and market relationships that had developed over centuries of regional trade. The contribution of individuals from Latin backgrounds to Roman political life during the Republic and early Empire involved their participation in governmental institutions, military commands, and administrative positions that utilized their regional knowledge, cultural connections, and specialized skills in service of Roman state interests. Political careers like that of Cicero, whose family origins in Arpinum provided him with perspectives on municipal life and Italian concerns that enhanced his effectiveness as an advocate and political leader, demonstrated the value of Latin cultural backgrounds in Roman political contexts, while showing successful integration of regional elites into central Roman institutions. Military leaders with Latin origins brought specialized knowledge of Italian terrain, population dynamics, and cultural sensitivities that proved valuable in Roman territorial expansion and provincial administration throughout the Mediterranean world. Their understanding of confederation politics, alliance relationships, and cultural negotiation techniques provided Roman commanders with capabilities essential for managing diverse populations and complex political situations that required sensitivity to local concerns and cultural traditions. The intellectual contributions of Latin-born individuals to Roman scholarly and literary culture involved their introduction of regional perspectives, cultural traditions, and specialized knowledge that enriched Roman intellectual life while preserving important elements of Latin cultural heritage. Scholars and writers from Latin municipalities brought familiarity with local historical traditions, religious practices, and cultural institutions that provided Roman intellectual culture with deeper understanding of Italian regional diversity and cultural development. The legal expertise developed in Latin municipalities contributed to Roman jurisprudence through the practical experience of local magistrates and legal practitioners who dealt with complex issues involving mixed populations, diverse legal traditions, and cultural conflicts that required sophisticated approaches to dispute resolution and administrative coordination. Legal innovations developed in municipal contexts often provided precedents for broader Roman legal development, while demonstrating effective approaches to managing cultural diversity within unified legal frameworks. The economic specializations that characterized different Latin territories provided Roman commercial development, with access to specialized production capabilities, resource bases, and technical expertise that enhanced overall economic productivity while maintaining regional economic identities and traditional production methods. Agricultural innovations developed in Latin territories, including improved cultivation techniques, crop varieties, and livestock breeding programs, contributed to Roman food security while preserving traditional farming practices and environmental management approaches that had proven effective over centuries of regional development. The artistic traditions maintained in former Latin territories contributed to Roman cultural development through the preservation and adaptation of traditional decorative techniques, architectural styles, and craft production methods that enriched Roman material culture, while maintaining regional artistic identities. Workshops in Latin municipalities continue to produce traditional ceramic styles, metalwork designs, and textile patterns, while incorporating Roman technical innovations and market preferences that created hybrid artistic expressions, combining the best elements of both traditions. The religious architecture of Latin municipalities reveals sophisticated approaches to preserving traditional sacred spaces while adapting them to Roman administrative requirements and ceremonial functions. Temple renovation projects employed Roman construction techniques and decorative elements while maintaining traditional spatial arrangements and ritual requirements that preserved essential elements of local religious identity. Archaeological investigation of these religious sites shows evidence of continued community investment in traditional spiritual practices alongside acceptance of Roman religious oversight and administrative coordination. The festival calendars maintained in Latin municipalities demonstrate complex negotiations between traditional seasonal celebrations and Roman administrative requirements that created opportunities for preserving community cultural traditions while ensuring compatibility with broader Roman political and religious obligations. Local festivals retained their traditional timing and ceremonial content, while accepting Roman official participation and oversight that prevented these gatherings from providing opportunities for political organisation or resistance activities against Roman authority. The gradual development of standardised Latin literary expression throughout former Latin territories involved educational initiatives and cultural programs that promoted sophisticated use of classical Latin, while preserving regional linguistic traditions and cultural knowledge that enriched Roman intellectual life. But the historical understanding of these processes would depend heavily on how later Roman historians chose to interpret and record the transformation of Latin identity within the expanding Roman state. The historiographical treatment of Latin origins and development by ancient writers created lasting frameworks for understanding this crucial period of Central Italian political and cultural evolution, though their accounts reflected the political concerns and cultural assumptions of their own times rather than purely objective historical analysis. Livy's monumental Urbe Condita provided the most comprehensive ancient treatment of Latin history, though his narrative approach emphasized moral exemplars and political lessons rather than systematic ethnographic or cultural analysis. Writing during the Augustan period, Livy drew extensively from earlier Roman historians and Latin local traditions to construct a narrative that portrayed Latin-Roman relationships as a natural progression toward Roman dominance justified by superior Roman virtues and divine favour. His account of early Latin kings and confederation politics preserved valuable historical details while embedding them within an interpretive framework that validated contemporary Roman imperial ideology and cultural supremacy claims. Livy's treatment of the Latin War and its aftermath demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of the political and military factors that had enabled Roman success, but his analysis reflected Augustan-era concerns about Italian integration and imperial unity, rather than contemporary perspectives on confederation politics and cultural autonomy. His description of Roman settlement policies toward defeated Latin communities emphasized Roman magnanimity and political wisdom, while minimizing the extent of Latin resistance and cultural loss that accompanied political integration. Archaeological evidence from sites mentioned in Livy's narrative generally supports his basic chronological framework while revealing more complex patterns of cultural continuity and transformation than his politically motivated account acknowledged. The preservation of specific details about Latin religious practices, political institutions, and military organizations in Livy's work reflected his access to local historical traditions and documentary sources that had maintained community memories of pre-Roman independence. His descriptions of the Feriae Latinae, Latin League assemblies, and Confederation military structures provided information unavailable from purely Roman sources while demonstrating the persistence of Latin cultural knowledge within Roman intellectual circles. These ethnographic details, embedded within his broader narrative of Roman territorial expansion, preserved crucial evidence for understanding Latin society and political organization that would otherwise have been lost. Dionysius of Halicarnassus approached Latin history from a different perspective, emphasizing the Greek cultural connections and influences that had shaped early Roman and Latin development. Writing as a Greek intellectual residing in Rome during the late 1st century BC, Dionysius sought to demonstrate the cultural sophistication of early Italian peoples while explaining Roman success in terms that would be comprehensible to Greek audiences familiar with their own colonial and political traditions. His Roman antiquities provided detailed accounts of Latin religious practices, political structures, and cultural institutions that complemented and sometimes corrected Livy's more politically oriented narrative. Dionysius's treatment of Aeneas traditions and Trojan settlement legends reflected his interest in connecting Latin origins to broader Mediterranean cultural networks while providing alternative explanations for Roman cultural achievements that did not depend solely on indigenous Italian development. His detailed descriptions of early Latin settlements, religious sanctuaries, and political assemblies drew from sources that preserved substantial ethnographic information about pre-Roman Latin society, though his interpretations reflected Greek cultural assumptions about political development and social organization that may not have accurately represented Latin perspectives on their own institutions. The archaeological evidence available to Dionysius through his residence in Rome and travels throughout central Italy enabled him to provide detailed descriptions of Latin material culture, architectural techniques, and urban planning that demonstrated sophisticated observation and analysis of physical remains. His accounts of Latin temple architecture, fortification systems, and domestic construction techniques preserved technical information that archaeological investigation has generally confirmed, indicating access to knowledgeable local informants and careful attention to physical evidence that enhanced the reliability of his cultural descriptions. Other ancient sources contributed additional perspectives on Latin history and culture that filled gaps in the major historiographical works while providing alternative interpretations of crucial events and developments. Pliny the Elder's natural history contained substantial information about Latin geographical features, natural resources, and economic activities that reflected systematic investigation of regional characteristics and historical development. His descriptions of Latin agricultural techniques, mineral resources, and craft production capabilities provided economic and environmental context for understanding the material foundations of Latin political and cultural achievements. Tacitus's references to Latin institutions and cultural practices in his historical works demonstrated the persistence of Latin cultural knowledge within Roman intellectual circles well into the imperial period, though his focus on later political developments provided limited detailed information about early Latin society and confederation politics. His analysis of Roman provincial administration and cultural policies reflected understanding of the precedents established during Latin integration that had influenced subsequent Roman approaches to territorial management and cultural assimilation throughout the Mediterranean world. The medieval rediscovery of Latin historical sources occurred through the preservation and copying of ancient manuscripts in monastic libraries and cathedral schools that maintained classical learning throughout the political disruptions of the early medieval period. The survival of substantial portions of Livy's work, though incomplete, provided medieval scholars with access to detailed narratives of early Roman and Latin history that influenced their understanding of political development and cultural change in ancient Italy. Manuscript traditions preserved in monasteries like Monte Cassino and Bobbio maintained copies of historical works that would later provide Renaissance humanists with source materials for reconstructing ancient Latin culture and society. The Renaissance revival of interest in classical antiquity created new approaches to studying Latin history that combined textual analysis of ancient sources with systematic investigation of physical remains and archaeological evidence. Humanist scholars like Flavio Biondo developed methodological approaches that utilize both literary sources and material evidence to reconstruct ancient Italian political and cultural development, creating more comprehensive understanding of Latin society than had been available during the medieval period. Their work established foundations for modern historical scholarship, while demonstrating the value of interdisciplinary approaches to understanding ancient cultures and societies. The development of Italian regional identities during the Renaissance involved conscious appropriation of ancient Latin cultural heritage as a source of political legitimacy and cultural distinction that differentiated Italian communities from other European peoples. City-states like Florence and Rome claimed direct descent from ancient Latin communities, while emphasizing their preservation of classical cultural traditions and political institutions that connected contemporary Italian achievements to ancient precedents. These cultural appropriations reflected genuine historical connections while serving contemporary political purposes that enhanced Italian claims to cultural superiority and political autonomy. The role of Latin historical traditions in constructing Renaissance Italian cultural identity involved systematic study of ancient sources, combined with archaeological investigation of physical remains that provided material evidence for ancient achievements and cultural sophistication. Scholars and artists drew inspiration from descriptions of ancient Latin architecture, sculpture, and urban planning, while adapting classical models to contemporary requirements and aesthetic preferences. The result was a cultural synthesis that preserved essential elements of ancient traditions while creating new artistic and intellectual expressions that demonstrated continuity between ancient and contemporary Italian civilization. Modern archaeological discoveries have substantially refined understanding of Latin culture and society through systematic excavation of settlement sites, religious sanctuaries, and burial grounds that have provided material evidence for social organization, economic activities, and cultural practices unavailable from literary sources alone. Excavations at sites like Lavinium, Praeneste, and various Alban Hill settlements have revealed sophisticated urban planning, advanced construction techniques, and complex material culture assemblages that demonstrate higher levels of cultural development than ancient sources had suggested. The archaeological investigation of Latin religious sites has provided crucial evidence for understanding spiritual practices and theological concepts that complemented and sometimes corrected ancient literary descriptions of Latin religious life. Excavations at sanctuaries like Diana Nemorensis and Jupiter Latiris have revealed architectural features, votive offerings, and ritual installations that demonstrate the sophistication of Latin religious architecture and ceremonial practices, while providing evidence for the persistence of traditional spiritual activities under Roman administration. Modern scholarship has recognized the crucial importance of Latin institutional innovations for the development of Roman political and legal systems that would later influence Western European governmental traditions. The Latin League's confederation structure provided precedents for Roman approaches to alliance management and territorial administration that became fundamental principles of Roman imperial government throughout the Mediterranean world. Latin legal concepts, including principles of municipal autonomy, citizenship rights, and commercial law, contributed to Roman jurisprudence in ways that influenced the development of legal systems throughout the former Roman Empire. The lasting impact of Latin cultural and institutional innovations on Western civilization occurred primarily through their incorporation into Roman, governmental, legal and cultural systems that transmitted Latin precedents throughout the Mediterranean world and into medieval and modern European development. Latin concepts of confederation politics, municipal government, and legal equality influenced Roman approaches to provincial administration that created governmental frameworks still visible in contemporary European political institutions and legal systems. The Latin contribution to the development of Roman military organisation involved tactical innovations, recruitment systems, and command structures that enabled Roman territorial expansion, while providing models for military administration that influenced warfare throughout the ancient Mediterranean world. Latin military traditions emphasized citizen-soldier participation, coordinated tactical movements, and integrated command structures that became fundamental characteristics of Roman legionary organization and strategic planning. The linguistic legacy of the Latins extends far beyond their direct territorial holdings through the spread of Latin language and literature throughout the Roman Empire and its subsequent influence on the development of Romance languages and legal terminology throughout Europe. While the original Latin dialects of central Italy were gradually replaced by standardized classical Latin, the linguistic innovations and cultural expressions developed in Latin territories contributed to the richness and flexibility of Latin literary language that enabled its adaptation to diverse cultural contexts throughout the Roman world. The study of Latin history continues to provide crucial insights into the processes of cultural integration, political confederation, and territorial expansion that characterized ancient Mediterranean development while offering historical precedents for understanding contemporary issues of political union, cultural preservation, and ethnic integration. The Latin experience demonstrates both the possibilities and limitations of confederation politics while showing how cultural traditions can survive and adapt within changing political frameworks that respect local autonomy while requiring participation in broader governmental structures. The transformation of the Latins from independent tribal communities to integrated components of Roman civilization represents one of history's most successful examples of cultural synthesis and political integration achieved through processes that preserved essential elements of local identity while creating unified governmental and military systems capable of territorial expansion and cultural transmission. Their institutional innovations, cultural achievements, and political traditions provided crucial foundations for Roman development, while demonstrating the creative possibilities that emerge when diverse communities cooperate in pursuit of common objectives while maintaining respect for their distinctive cultural heritage and historical traditions. The historical memory of the Latins thus encompasses both their specific contributions to ancient Italian development and their broader significance as exemplars of successful cultural adaptation and political integration that created lasting institutional and cultural legacies influencing Western civilization for over 2 millennia. Their story demonstrates that political unity and cultural diversity need not be mutually exclusive, but can instead create synergistic relationships that enhance both collective capabilities and individual community achievements through cooperative frameworks that balance common objectives with respect for local traditions and autonomous governance.